She might have stepped away. I don't know. There
No,
she is.
I'm here.
My phone was, my computer was on mute, so I don't know who if anyone was saying anything. Okay, here I am. All right, go ahead, Pam. I'm going to text Will.
Okay. Well, this is our, I guess, second to last PHED committee work session on the SSP. You'll be having one more primarily on transportation. So this is probably the one that is mostly dedicated to school conversation. And as you'll see, the staff report focused on the evaluation of school adequacy standards and rules when school service areas are deemed overutilized. There's also some information today that we'll talk about related to the motor vehicle adequacy test mitigation priorities. And lastly, we'll talk about the name change. But as you know, so this staff report in some earlier version was released as an addendum to an earlier work session that we didn't have time to cover. It's been rewritten for this morning's work session so that I could take into consideration. Councilmember Jawando did provide a memo to his committee and council colleagues after that addendum was written that was related to this material. So we've gone through, rewritten, and made reference to the recommendations in that memo. But so the first thing we're going to take up, the primary thing, is going to be the utilization premium payments. This is recommendation 4.16 in the planning board's draft, and it establishes what's called a utilization premium payment, which is a fee paid by applicants when a school's projected utilization exceeds 120% is what the board was proposing. And it would apply to each service area as shown on table 1 in the staff report, which is also a table that's included in the planning board's draft. And according to the draft, if schools serving a residential development are over capacity, then the developer, as a condition of their preliminary plan approval, would be required to make this payment. The payment, according to the draft, would be made by the developer when it applies for a building permit based on the annual school test in effect at that time. If multiple schools serving a project exceed a given threshold, then payments will be required for each school level. And the utilization premium payment is based on a percentage of the applicable standard impact tax, and it's factored by the school level to reflect relative impact different housing units have on student enrollment at these levels. But there's several elements that will get covered this morning that the committee can weigh in on and give us direction. The one being who should be required to make the payment, or more precisely, what are the adequacy standards that should determine which applicants will be required to make the UPP, or the utilization premium payment, meaning what thresholds of utilization get reached or seat deficit combined. What should they pay? So should they pay 30%, 50%, 25% of the tax? And when should they pay it? And we'll cover each of those in order. You may want to make a comprehensive decision toward the end of the work session as you work through different pieces of it. I think they have implications for each other. But the first two are what factors determine whether a utilization premium payment is required. And the planning board suggests that the UPP kick in when utilization exceeds 120%. And in lieu of a moratorium standard in the turnover and infill areas, this is how they've set up their recommendation. There was a version of sort of the UPP, and I'm sure Councilmember Reamer remembers, it was a school facility payment, and it was created as a way to slow development based on the premise that some projects would choose not to pay a fee to move forward, would wait for capacity funding to come forward and lower the utilization rates. But it was a way, if the payments were there, to get more funding for school infrastructure as schools started to become more crowded. And the school facility payment started at 105%. It was discontinued in 2016 when the impact taxes were increased to 120% of the cost of a student seat. The planning board and the GO committee have concurred that the cost of a student seat should be calculated at 100%. So this does open the door to say if we're kind of moving away from the greater than 100% premium for impact taxes. when do we start to consider funding mechanisms to address overcrowding, and the UPP is one way to do that. The second piece of this, and I just want to talk about before you get into a broader discussion of how to choose certain things, thresholds and percentages, is just that we've typically had a standard. The test has been done with two measures, not just utilization, but the seat deficit. And the reason the seat deficit was introduced was to really get at the fact that we have schools of all different sizes. So 120% in a very small school, maybe such a small number of seats over capacity that they don't trigger any kind of action by MCPS. And the letter we got from the superintendent of schools also supported the use of continuing to use the seat deficit as a measure of adequacy. And in this case, we've modified it just slightly. We've been using seat deficit numbers, but they were based on more the state rated capacity. So in line with our program capacity, we've adjusted them slightly to now look more like program capacity seat deficit numbers.
I have a question there. You know, we're talking a fair bit today about the different thresholds at which a UPP might kick in. And you said here that you recommend we use both, you know, the overall capacity and the seat deficit. Is there a corresponding seat deficit, you know, chart that says, here's what a 105% capacity seat deficit looks like. Here's what 110% equivalent looks like.
Right.
Are they the same all the way through?
So they have over time, well, so when we introduced using seat deficits, I think was done back in the 2016 SSP. And when that was done, it was tied to the deficit at 120%. We only had that, right? We no longer have the school facility payment. So we knew, if you look at the facility master planning for MCPS, and I see Ms. McGuire's here, she can talk to this as well. They have a section where they say, okay, when at an elementary level, when 92 seats really trigger sort of capacity planning or facility planning, and maybe they use a different term, I may not be getting that right. And it's 150 seats, I believe, for a middle school, and it's 200 seats for a high school. So those were the numbers we knew were their triggers, okay? And this was back in 2016. So what was done was, okay, at 120%, 20% overutilization is when we start to think of crowded. Again, that can be different for different school sizes. So how do we also incorporate that we don't want to capture, say, a 400 student school at 20% over capacity is only 80 seats over capacity. And if they don't really start to do planning for capital planning until 92 seats, if we are shutting down, because that was the standard then, it was 120 for moratorium, shutting down development in the service area, when MCPS isn't even planning, we have to have some measure, some way to like at least make these things somewhat can work together. And so we picked the seat deficit number and increased it by 20% to say, if 20% is what is unacceptable when you were over that amount, then let's really, and that's when moratorium went in. Now we're considering these thresholds and the seat deficit in a slightly different way, because it really is going to be about making a payment. It's a little different than a hard stop. But again, still useful to have the seat deficit because we want to tie it to when there's programming. Again, a fee is for when something's overcrowded, and the fee should have some significance. And if MCPS isn't going to be planning anything in that area, the deficit isn't quite great enough, the two need to still be tied together.
Understood. I guess what I'm asking is, you know, this memo presents the kind of, it says it's both. I think it says both. It's not.
Right. It's both.
It's both. But what happens if we? So that you've provided us that information for what both is at 120%.
Right, and I would say no. I in the memo actually on the. I don't have page numbers on my draft that printed at home, but it's
or 125% actually is page 2. I think I see.
Well,
I see the.
Okay, so see on table 1 is the planning board's recommendation. So those seat deficit numbers are higher because they've increased them to match 125%. If you go to the table 4, you'll see that that's where we're talking about the planning staff's recommended or council staff's recommendation for school You'll see, and at
So you've got a
105,
matching,
it's gone down.
got it.
Right.
You've
And
got a
there's sort of the
matching,
minimum amount of program capacity where you start to plan facilities.
okay. I'm clear there. Thank you. Keep going.
Sorry, it was a long explanation.
Just to say, you've got a matching seat deficit tabulation starting at 105%. So it can be both all along. You can do that. Okay.
Correct. And as you increase those thresholds, those seat deficit numbers would increase by the same percentage.
Got it.
Right. So those are the pieces that are working together. Again, the recommendation or one of the questions is how, when should they pay as that threshold? How much should an applicant pay in an overutilized area? That's going to be about setting those percentages. You have the recommendation from Councilmember Joando to start at 105 up to 120 at a 50% rate, and then from 120 to 135 at 100% of the impact tax. And remember, this is another wrinkle to this too that I think is sometimes gets lost. You're charging the utilization premium payment at the school level that is inadequate. You would only actually equal the full impact tax when all three school levels are inadequate. Because the impact tax is combined. It is your impact for all three school levels based on a structure type. And when you're doing the utilization premium payment, it's a fee related to school level. So it gets broken down to a finer grain, more detail. And so, some people might look at some of the numbers in the chart and say, well, why do the UPPs look so low? It's because you'd have to add them across the three school levels to get to that full percentage of the impact tax, whether that be 60, 50, or 100. So if you have questions on it when we go through the charts, I'm happy to answer it, but it's just another wrinkle that sometimes is confusing.
I want to just make sure I understand that wrinkle you just explained. You average all three levels of the school together to determine the UPP, the threshold?
No, you basically the opposite. For an impact tax, it represents the impact on all three school levels, right? When we show an impact tax table, we're really showing it for structure type and now under the draft by regions. But it's not broken down by school level. It's an impact tax for somebody building say a multifamily unit on all the school levels that their students coming out of that unit will participate in. When we do the UPP, now we have to step back a little bit because you may only be inadequate at the elementary level, or you may only be inadequate at the high school level. So we won't charge you for all three school levels being inadequate, just the one.
And the UPP is a per student calculation, right? So exactly, you could be two students at one.
It's still a structure level calculation, but it's based on the relative impact of the inadequate school level for that fee. I'm not explaining this great, Mr. Sartori can jump in, but it's trying to it's just sort of.
Well, I guess what I was sort of asking is if you are over capacity in two of the three levels, your fee is going to be based on the specific level of overcapacity of those two levels.
Yes.
Correct. Right.
So it's based on the actual projected number of students. Okay. We'll keep going, and then I think we should hear from the planning board about their recommendation. And I know Mary Beck wanted to make some comments about UPPs, but I hope that they are focused on this part of the discussion because we're not through the whole discussion about UPP.
Right, and I think this is a good place to stop because I think right now the conversation is about at what level do you set them, what percentage thresholds, and at what percentages of the impact tax do you charge, what is appropriate. There are some other pieces to this once the committee wants to weigh in on all that has to do with what do they fund? Do they stay in the school service area? Do they stay in the cluster at the same school level? We can discuss that in a bit. And then the whole conversation about how the proposed process for payment at building permit needs to get discussed, but I don't think that needs to get done at this point in the conversation. So.
In a few minutes. Okay. Good morning, Mr. Anderson.
Hi there. So I'm just trying to make sure that I understand this explanation because I wasn't entirely clear on that. But if what Ms. Dunn is saying is that there's the council staff is recommending no UPP unless the school is both over 105% of capacity and meets the seat deficit threshold, then I feel a lot more comfortable with that, because I think that means, in effect, you're talking about, for example, at the elementary school level, you would be actually in practice more like 110%, not 105%. And I think that that's principled and reasonable in light of the way this works in the real world, because MCPS, in my experience, doesn't consider capacity expansions as 105%. They just, I mean, they recognize that that's perhaps not the ideal capacity for which the school is built, but they don't start planning in addition until you get to the seat threshold, as Pam was describing. So I would say that we're not allergic to having the UPP apply at some level below 120, but we don't think you should go down to 105. It seems like there's a sweet spot in the middle that not only avoids jacking the impact tax rates back up, which is part of the objective of this exercise, to get them more in line so we're more competitive with the region, make it more economic to build housing, but also is more aligned with the way that MCPS actually makes decisions about when to add capacity to the school.
Yep. Okay. Jason, anything to add there? Okay. Mary Beck, you don't have your camera on yet. Is this the time when you wanted to share some comments about UPP?
Sure. I think just a couple things that I will say, because I remember having to work with the school facility payments, and they were difficult on some practical levels. The concern with the UPPs is sort of twofold. One is that they're less than what we had been collecting with the 20% bump up, and they're less predictable. And I think that what we had done with the school facility payments was we would never assume that funding until we had it in hand. And then when you get into other complexities about whether you're going to limit where it's going to be used, or as Casey just mentioned, if we're collecting money but can't spend it until MCPS does something, but they're not at a threshold yet where they're going to do it, we're literally going to be sitting on money unused, and it won't be accomplishing, I think, what people had hoped. I guess the other thing, I have a little bit of a clarification question, and that relates to what someone would pay. My understanding of the planning board recommendation was that the UPP was structured so there'd be certain percentage payments by the school level. And so I thought if you were 3 students or 10 students over, whatever the cut line, the threshold is, you'll make that percentage of an impact tax payment. I did not think it was literally per student, so that somebody being 3 students over will pay less than someone paying having 20 students over. And maybe I'm misunderstanding the prior conversation, but I thought it was just if you're over the level for this school, it's X percent of impact taxes. So that's more.
That's correct.
I'm glad some of the most expert people in the room are also. Okay, makes me feel better. Does anyone want to respond to Mary Beck's questions from the planning board or council staff?
Ms. Beck, it still will relate to hitting a threshold and being overcrowded in a school service area. It won't be related to just 3 students over or 10 students over. Basically, that'll be set at the annual school test. There will be, this school service has this condition, and then projects that come in that area will be conditioned to what they have to do.
That's right. I mean, if you're in the range in this particular case between 105 and 120%, at say just the elementary school level, then for each student that development is generating, you pay the per student rate for the elementary school. That's what the school facility payment works, right?
That you're building. No, it's for every unit that you're building.
Right, for each unit.
I just want to make that clear, because this is, they're going to be looking at units.
It is, it's the units, but it's based on the trip generation translates to students.
Yes, it is based on this,
But is
Right.
it for every level of the school? Do you assume that that student is having an impact at every level of the school, and so therefore it's
No.
3 layers? No, it's only one layer at a time.
Right.
One layer at a time.
It could be 1 or 2 or all 3. It could be, right. And that's what Pam was saying earlier about the impact. If these individual, if there's only one area, one level which is affected, that reads seems small, but that's because compared to the impact tax, because the impact tax is looking at the trip generation of all students at all levels from that development. So that's why.
You had to work in trip generation, didn't you?
Oh gosh, student generation. I'm sorry. Once a
Oh.
transportation planner, always. Sorry.
I was getting the metaphor, but I thought it was unusual to speak in transportation metaphors. This conversation's already complicated enough. All right. Questions from my colleagues? All right.
I have a question for council staff on the, obviously I made the recommendation on the payments to starting at 105, similar to yours, but slightly higher. I just wanted to know the reasoning for the slightly lower payments from your perspective.
Sure. So I think when I was writing my evaluation, looking at the past parameters for the school facility payment, they basically always been at 60% of the cost of the impact tax. So if you were paying, and back then the impact tax was 90% of the cost of a seat. The idea was if you were in an area that was affected, say at all 3 school levels, you'd be paying 150% of the impact tax. You'd be paying the 90% cost of or 150% cost of the student seat, right? You pay the 90% impact tax, you pay the 60% school facility payment combined. They really, if at all 3 school levels were inadequate, you'd be paying 150% impact tax to the cost of the seat. So I kind of used that as a starting point, and I know the planning board probably did something similar because their recommendation at 120 started again at that 60% level. And impact taxes had gone back down though, the cost of student seat now being calculated at 100%. So now it's, rather than say 150, it's 160, kind of getting in that same ballpark. But sensitive to the fact that I think that we should start collecting before the 120% threshold. If 120 was where we stopped development previously, it didn't seem appropriate that we would hit 120 before we start collecting any funding, if in fact that's supposed to replace the moratorium.
Right,
in the county.
and recognizing the point that Ms. Beck brought up that we're not replacing what we lose here.
Correct.
Okay. Well, obviously, I don't know what the chair wants to do. I don't know how we're moving through this or how you want to approach the decision points, but I made some recommendations here.
Correct. Well, the council staff has laid out a structure so we'll proceed through the memo to take the decisions at the appropriate time as outlined in the memo. And we'll let council staff kind of keep us on course here. And Meredith, if you'd like to make some comments, we've received the county executive's testimony. His views are outlined in the packet. So, I'm not going to necessarily invite you to articulate those views at every point. They're laid out in the packet, but I'll give you a chance to make some comments, here at the outset.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I only really want to make one comment on behalf of the county executive, and that is to emphasize how important he believes it is that the payments start at a threshold like 105%. And the reasons for that have been sought out very well by council staff and by council member Jawando, but it's because you want to get the money early enough that you can plan with that money and you don't end up with serious overcrowding while you're waiting for the construction of either a new school or an addition. So that's really the only point that I'll make, and I'll just listen to the discussion.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Pam, let's
So I think a useful place to move, since you if you read through the staff report, Councilmember Jawando's recommendation, staff's recommendation. We can start at sort of that threshold plus percentage idea. Table 5 in the staff report, the committee had previously said, let's base our projections, let's base our annual school test looking 4 years at projected enrollment and projected capacity. And using that, Table 5 lays out what school service areas would be affected under different thresholds. So when you're at 105%, that column is all of those schools would be affected by whatever the rule is at 105%. If you go to column 2, which is 120%, those are the service areas that would be affected by whatever rule is in place for 120. And then the same thing, I put 125 in there because that's where the planning board had recommended the Greenfield moratorium. I put 135 since that's in the staff report. And I put 150 in there for context because, again, that's Gaithersburg's SSP threshold. So this table was a way to just frame it for the committee to say, you get a broad picture of which school service areas would be affected under the different thresholds. If you turn to table 6, what you'll see is what the planning board had proposed. It was a 3-year projection, crossed out or added in red, basically to let you know what happened under the 4-year projection. And then moving to table 7, really it's probably table 5 and 7. So 7 is saying, okay, here, let's say we start at 105. What schools fall in 105, but just 105, right? Because, and that's why it gets a little confusing, 120, if you're at 120, but not greater, then you'd be affected by the 120 threshold. If you're at 135, but not greater than 135. So what you see is at 105, those are the high schools, there's no middle schools, and those are the elementaries. You would have to do whatever you decide. Is it making the UPP payment? If you go up to 120, it's a second tier of payment or moratorium or whatever, then those schools in the middle column on table 7 would be the ones affected. And then at 135 with a 4-year projection horizon, at 135, those are the schools, again, either by a third tier payment or countywide moratorium. Okay. So I think the conversation between committee members can be what's appropriate thresholds.
All right. Well, Councilmember Jawando has provided a memo. Councilmember Friedson, would you like to make some comments? I think the starting point is certainly for me what planning board has recommended, but interested to hear what my colleagues have to say. All right.
Sure. Yeah. So a couple things. One, appreciate all of the deliberation here. I am pleased with how this whole process is going. I think we're moving things in the right direction, keeping the spirit of what the planning board was trying to do, but really diving into the details and tweaking accordingly. I think there's an opportunity to do that here as well. As with the previous conversation, I do think we need to tie in the seat deficit because I think we should be consistent with how MCPS handles these decisions, but lowering the threshold from 120 to 105 seems appropriate. Obviously, that's where Councilmember Jawando is. I agree with him on that as well. I just wanted to note something, and I think this is important, and I think when we get to the question of what the threshold should be, because I think Councilmember Jawando's proposal is higher than I believe it should be in terms of what the numbers are, but I think we'll have a deliberation and discuss where we land on that. But the school facilities payment, the suggestion has been made that the purpose of that was to slow down development. And I don't think that's what the purpose of these are supposed to be. This is not the anti-growth policy. This is a policy that is supposed to be implemented to ensure adequate public facilities for the growth that we have and for the communities that we want. And so what this really needs to be is a mechanism to appropriately generate resources in order to fund the infrastructure that we need to support the growth that we want. That's what this policy from a high level is about. And so then the question is, at what point does it make sense to charge premiums because there are added costs that are being incurred? And what is an appropriate cost in order to fulfill the obligation of this policy, which is to have the facilities that we need to support the students we're going to have and the transportation infrastructure we're going to need in order for people to move to and from. So yes, I support lowering it to 105, beginning there. Ultimately, we'll talk about the seat adequacy to be consistent with MCBS, because all of this disconnect between planning and MCPS and the council and not everybody being on the same page has always concerned me. And so I think as much as we can bring these decision points together would be helpful. And when we get to it, the conversation later on, figuring out the point at which we're not doing moratorium by a different name here, that shouldn't be the goal. It should be how to generate the revenue necessary to support the infrastructure and the public facilities that we need.
Okay. Councilmember Juan.
Sure. Yeah, I can just add. Obviously, I laid it out in the memo that where I am, but again, I think I'm glad to hear. I was going to ask Councilmember Friedson when he said I agree, just to you could just stop right there, didn't have to say anything else. But no, I'm glad we agree on starting at 105. Again, I actually largely agree with the point of the policy that it's, we want adequate infrastructure and planning funds for the communities that are going to be built, and that's what this is about. I agree with that premise overall. The reasoning for the percentages is that if we had a moratorium policy, which we all agreed is not working, was not ideal, but if that shut down everything at 120, it seems to make sense that there was some reasoning, which I think is largely correct, that that's a significant overcrowding situation. And at that point, to collect 100% of the impact tax at a point where we were previously shutting everything down seems to be appropriate to me, considering, again, that I understand why the planning board has gone this way, but considering the dramatic shift here and how much money we're going to be getting for the infrastructure that we need in a situation where there's already many overcrowded schools. As I lay out in my memo, even with the payments kicking in when they do, at the 50% level at 105 and 100% after 120, you still have significant, you still have schools that are in that situation. So I think we want to err on the side of having the appropriate and enough money to get the planning going, and again, realizing we're still not going to have everything we need, and that's not the point of this. It's the impact of the development. But so that's why I just think it was important for me to point out why I think the numbers are appropriate at the higher levels. And I do want to note that the staff memo does say they don't object to the higher numbers, but I get the reasoning of why you tied it to the other, other practices. So I understand that, and that's why I asked that question. So I'm glad we agree on 105, but that's my reasoning for the slightly higher thresholds.
As a point of personal privilege, the staff also supports keeping moratorium, but I just wanted to.
All right. Well, I do have concerns about 105 because we know that the school system isn't going to do anything at 105.
But do we know that? Is planning start or anything? Can we actually probe that question?
Essie's here.
Hi, thank you. I'm happy to jump in on this. So certainly, I think saying that we wouldn't do anything is perhaps an overstatement, but it is important to know that we certainly don't start planning an addition immediately at a certain percentage of the school, in part because we don't want to come ask the council for funding for a 1-room addition or a 2-room addition, right? That's also not an effective use of resources. And unless we see a trend that's going to increase to where we need 4, 5, 6 number of rooms, then we're going to try to manage that through non-capital means, such as relocatables, which again, for 1 or 2 classrooms that may go up or down, is a very appropriate response. It's certainly when, again, we start crossing over 4, 5, 6 classrooms and that add to the additional core space where we do start planning for an addition or a capital project. And that's where those seat thresholds come in also. Certainly 85 students over at an elementary school is very different than 85 students over at a high school. And so again, it's really about sort of where that capacity fits in with the programming at the school. The other factor, and the one piece that can change our perspective, because again, these are guidelines, they're not hard rules, would be the nature of the site. So for example, if we have a site where we know it's just very, very challenging to add more portables, or we're going to take up a certain amount of room, that could trigger a different analysis on our part. Nonetheless, again, still, we're not going to come to the council and ask for a 1 or 2 room addition because it's just not an effective use of construction or resources. So we're really, again, looking at major construction of a certain, to a larger size degree. And that's where the planning comes in at those seat deficits, because again, that's when, you know, we can sometimes add to different pieces of a school, but if we really need additional classrooms of that quantity, we're not going to be able to just accommodate that within the existing footprint. Does that help give some context to our planning processes?
Yeah, to me it does.
Sure.
I think if the assumption is that a school that's at 105 is heading to 125 or something, you know, that's that, you know, but that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, and a school that is at 105 indefinitely is.
And that's where, again, we don't, it's not like we say, well, 105, we can't do anything. If it's 105 and we see that there's an immediate, you know, again, it's really, again, at that point about the trends and about the experience that we see. Sometimes we know that we're going to have a bubble that's not going to last. So even if it bumps over for 1 year, we might try to accommodate it some way and have it come back down. So that is where those trends matter. And again, if we see the trend heading up, we don't necessarily need to wait. I think that part of the issue there does become the context of the CIP, because again, certainly, if we come to the council with keeping in mind that we have a system-wide number of requests, we are going to have to prioritize those, and one that's at 105 for longer than another one may wait another year before we bring it forward. Doesn't mean we haven't thought about it or started any planning, but triggering a funding request does, again, need to be at a certain level of criticality.
Andrew. Oh, Glenn, did you have a
Yeah,
comment?
I just wanted to add to Essie's point. The 92 student seat deficit for elementary school, I guess it would be 85, it was at 105%, is roughly 4 classrooms worth of students. And the other numbers in there are roughly equal to 5 or 6 or 7 classrooms, depending on which level you're talking about. So it goes right to Essie's point about they wouldn't be looking at doing an addition if it's only 2 classrooms. Another thing to point out is that the money, at least for the school facility payment, I would presume here too, excuse me, could be used not necessarily in the same elementary school service area, but it could be one that it could be put towards an addition at a neighboring elementary school service area, which will then relieve the pressure on this first elementary school. So it goes to solving the problem. Solving the problem doesn't always mean adding it at that school. It could be another school where there's an effective boundary change that's going to happen. That's something else to think about. And the reason why, one other point, because I heard this in the discussion earlier from Ms. Dunn and also from Mr. Friedson, the rationale for doing school facility payments in the first place really wasn't to slow down growth. It was really Ms. Wellington's point about saying that if you're over 100%, you presumably have a problem to some degree. You didn't want to charge something which was going to be just 101, 102% because the numbers can fluctuate easily across that threshold. So the thought was at 105%, and back in 2007 when this was discussed, it was actually 110% that the Board of Education and the Planning Board recommending, was sort of a break point as to when, in this now you really have a problem, it's going to be growing, it's going to eventually hit us. And so let's get, if the developer wants to pay, remember this is his or her choice, it is not a tax, it's a fee, would go then towards putting forward money towards that improvement. So just a little bit of background is all I wanted to give you that.
I appreciate it. I was reflecting Ms. Dunn's comment about slowing the pace of the development and the fact that the premise behind the school facility payment, as noted in the staff packet that you and Ms. Dunn put together, specifically referred to the purpose of the school facilities payment being created as a way to slow the pace of development based on the premise that projects would choose not to move forward due to the added cost. So, I wasn't putting my own perspective on this. I was citing the staff report that you have so ably put together and was noting that. And I think that is a appropriation of priorities based on what we're trying to do here. That might have been why in the old regime of why it was put into place, but I think that is not what we're trying to do here. That's not in the spirit of what we should be trying to do here, which is to generate the revenue we need for the resources that the growth that we want will create. And that is the entire purpose behind this policy. But I appreciate the perspective. I do think we're missing the point here a little bit. I think we're heading in the direction anyway, but when we talk about a specific project, when we talk about, what will trigger exactly at what point, that is moratorium. That is the premise behind the idea of moratorium, that you need a specific project in a PDF in order to prevent a draconian measure from taking place. We're trying to smooth that out. We're trying to eliminate this, binary challenge of, putting in a specific project at a specific place at a specific trigger that either keeps development going or stops development entirely, which everybody agrees is a bad outcome for resources for the schools and for getting the type of economic development and housing and other type of development that we want. So, I think we need to get out of this premise of, what is the exact trigger point and where is exactly the project. I do think as later on in the packet, there's a discussion of a rational nexus. That definitely makes sense. If you're charging a fee and not a broad tax, there should be a rational nexus by definition. But I think, as we've continued down this discussion, I think we're getting back into the trap of the paradigm that moratorium is focused on, which is that you need a specific project that addresses a specific dynamic in order to move forward with development. We're trying to move out of that and have a better way to generate the resources that we need to provide the capacity that we have in our schools. And so with that, Ms. McGuire, I wasn't entirely sure where you were going with the comments in terms of 105%. Do you think that is an appropriate place from the school's perspective of where to begin the utilization premium payments?
So again, certainly the school system supports generating additional revenue and understands that the revenue supports the solutions we need to put forward. My comments were really just to add context to when the board typically requests construction from the council, which again is sort of a different level of planning than some of the other kinds of planning that we might do. And so the seat deficit as represented, and I think this is where we do agree with Ms. Dunn, that again, 85 seats, 85 kids over at an elementary school is a very different experience than at a high school. And that's where those seat deficits come into play. That also is reflected in the percent, but the percent sometimes can be different. It can be experienced differently depending on the underlying size of the school. So I'm not trying to split too many hairs, but the question about when does the school system request construction funding, again, that's been important in the past, to your point, to prevent a moratorium. Whether or not a school is overcrowded and when we might be able to access those funds, I think there can often be other solutions, or as Dr. Orland was pointing out, we might be able to use those funds at an adjacent school where then we actually could offload some of those capacities. So I think that flexibility to look at how to accommodate capacity in an area is helpful, as opposed to saying it has to be an addition at this school or it doesn't count. That was really the context that we were trying to provide. Got it.
I appreciate that, and I share those, general views. So I am going to support. I don't know if we're doing it as part of this decision point or as a subsequent decision point, but I am supportive of the 105%, as I noted before, and I do believe that we should be consistent with the school system with the seat deficit standard as part of that. And I make the decision, at least, at seeing those as part and parcel as part of the same decision point.
I think certainly, I think we're all in agreement about the seat deficit, right? So we can start with the thresholds then. Okay, well, we can. I'm not sure exactly how you proceed with saying there should be a threshold at 105 and then what the rate is, and then someone can say there should be another threshold at another point, and then what the rate is? Is that?
Well, the way that the packet is set up, I thought was set up at is 120 the right place to start? If not, what is the rate? I think you have at least 2 votes here, and I'm not sure where you will end up saying we should start at 105.
Right.
We've all agreed now that there's going to be a seat deficit. So it's a seat deficit threshold has been decided. 105, we need to have a formal, and then I think we should move into what are the percentages at the point that the committee decided. At least that's how I would be comfortable personally.
All right. Well, I can get down with that with some nervousness about starting too low, 105, but it's probably fine. So we can start the first threshold at 105.
That's 2.5 to 0.5 votes.
We've had a bunch of 2.5 votes on this
Technically 2.6
committee during this process. I've never quite seen anything like it, actually.
2.6.
Yay. Okay. So yeah, I think that Councilmember Friedson's direction made sense. That the next would be, you can either then choose at what what happens at 105. Is it a charge at 30%, 50%, 60%, 25%, and then choose the next threshold? That might be the
And obviously, I have a view on this. I proposed a percentage as I talked about. So I'd like to find some commonality here if we can.
So, Councilmember Joanna, you had proposed what to happen at 105 again? Tell us.
Now I'm confused. I think it was 50%.
Yeah, your proposal was 50% at
105,
100% at 120.
Yeah.
Originally, moratorium at 135, although that may have, I'm not sure if you have a different perspective now from your amendment.
Yes. So that was the, and I think I just said a couple minutes ago why I thought that was appropriate. So.
All right, Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate. Sorry.
Before you start, I don't know if Mary Beck has a question. You can proceed with your.
Sure, please.
Yeah.
Ms. Beck.
Okay, I had a question. I realized I didn't know if this was an eligible use for the UPPs, but as we were talking about the school's process and not wanting to sort of have money go unused, I did not know, can we use the premium payments for planning costs, or is it only for construction?
In the past, school facility payments were used for either the design or construction of an addition or a new school, but not for facility planning. And I don't believe it was ever used for that, because there's, in the facility planning, now we're going to talk CIP jargon, sorry folks.
Yeah.
In the CIP PDF, project description form for facility planning, it doesn't set aside a certain amount of money for the planning of an individual school. Plus, at that stage, you really don't know what you're building. You may end up deciding that you're not going to build anything at that school. So it's only when there's actually a standalone PDF for it, for, say, an addition. But the money can, in fact, has been used for helping to fund the design of that school, because the design and construction all part and parcel of the same thing. Does that answer your question, Mary?
Yeah, I'm as flexible as we can be on the use. To me, it's better. So I would have liked it if we could have used it for facility planning, but understand what's been done in the past and what you're saying.
What's the decision point on that? Is it can't we say that it can be used for that, or why couldn't
don't we have a decision point later? I didn't mean to interrupt, Councilmember Joanna, but don't we have a decision point later about the question of nexus and how we define that? And we are going to have to establish, through law, what a UPP. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with you, Ms. Beck, but I think there's an opportunity for that discussion. I mean, I'd probably lean more towards design, but not facilities planning, because facilities planning is pretty amorphous in terms of, what it is. It's usually like a PDF with a bunch of things on it, and we figure out, what to do with them later on. And I think, we owe it to residents to be a little bit more specific about that. I'm not sure you have a nexus with a PDF that's that broad and countywide personally, but don't we have a decision point on that we're going to have to decide as a policy matter how UPs work, where they can be spent, and we can take up what they can be used on at that point, I would think.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, let's
Okay. Yeah, so that makes
This morning.
all right,
Okay, are we back to ups?
back to ups.
Okay, so I very much appreciate Councilmember Joando's memo early on. I understand the philosophy behind it. I think that in practice, it's significantly more aggressive than I think would meet the spirit behind what we're trying to do. And so I'm hoping that we can, find a place for it. I think it was a really good place to start the conversation. However, I will say what I said before. I mean, I think by lowering the threshold to 105, the purpose is to generate resources needed to meet the infrastructure, which is the whole purpose of this policy. And so I think we have to find that balance. And the goal shouldn't be to set a rate that stops development. It should be to set a rate that generates revenue, that meets the needs that we have. And threading that needle and finding that appropriate balance, I think, is critical. I think it's the work that's before us, and I think it's the whole purpose behind this policy and the paradigm shift that we're having for why moratorium doesn't work the way that we want and the way that we intend it to. And I think we need to be really careful of creating moratorium by a different name by having such a high threshold that it does shut down development, which cuts off the resources. Additionally to that, I think we have to remember we can't get too aggressive to overcharge new residents for the cost of existing residents. And I think we have to be really careful about that. And impact taxes in general are a challenge in that regard, because it isn't the fault of the new resident that they're moving into a place that already has an overcrowded school, whether it's 99% crowded or 106% crowded. That new resident had nothing to do with that. And so, I think we have to find the appropriate balance in order to do this. So my proposal would be 20% at 105%, 40% at 120%, and 60% at 135%. I do believe we should have a third, threshold at 135%. So that's where, I think it balances the generating revenue, not intending to shut down, all development and become an effective moratorium, which I know is nobody's intention here, and reflects significant costs and significant resources that we all know our school system desperately needs.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you. Councilmember Joando, did you want to articulate your?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's too low. I appreciate the effort and the recommendation. I was just looking back at the memo to see. I think that was lower than staff's recommendations too, if I'm correct, which is not consistent with kind of the past practice. So I kind of saw staff's recommendation as the floor, but I guess that was my perspective. So
that's because they agreed. They largely agreed with you.
Right. Yeah, I guess that helps sometimes. I just think we're talking about 135. We'll see where the moratorium idea goes in full council and all that, but or what that middle ground is. But if we're heading in that direction, I don't know why we would never collect the full the full 100% of the impact, even at those outer reaches of high levels. So I think that's 60%. So I would be happy to go with council staff's recommendation, which is lower again than mine. I think this whole policy, the amount of, revenue is going to be collected to support our infrastructure is going to go down, overall. And I think we need to recognize that. And I know that's the attempt here to try to recognize that, to the point of the residents versus other residents, I do think we need to avoid that. I mean, if you have no children and you're paying your property taxes, and that's an argument that you get from people. So I think it's just part of the social contract of your community. And I don't think these levels would discourage development. I think we list the chart. Maybe Ms. Dunn, could you talk about the differences in the payment structure and how that's related to kind of what's happening now? Because I didn't see it as something that was way out of bounds or so overprescriptive that a developer wouldn't want to move forward.
Right. The charts are in the staff report. They've been updated slightly since the report was written. The planning staff has gone back due to some other conversation and decisions that the committee's made regarding the walk shed and the purple line and the red policy areas, the boundaries shifted slightly, which does always change student generation rates when you include more different housing types in different locations. But for the most part, these numbers are the same, and they're listed on pages, I don't know the page number, tables 9 and 10 and 11, tables 9, 10, 11 in the staff report. They show what those premium payments would be at 60%, 50%, 30% ratios. And you can see them across the board and they don't change greatly.
Right.
To 30 from 60 obviously is half.
Right. So you're talking about for a single family detached in an infill area at 30% being, $2,500 roughly, and for an elementary, and then $4,900 for 60%. Yeah. So I don't think that's going to discourage development to go to those levels. And again, considering you're talking about 120 being the former cutoff of when you couldn't do anything, I think that's an appropriate point, again, to collect a much higher payment. And certainly at 135, so maybe there's a way for us to slide the scale a little bit, but, I'm curious to hear where Councilmember Reamer, you get to be in the position now. So.
Thanks. It's an interesting dynamic, that's for sure. My starting point was I thought the planning board proposal was fine, but thinking through it at different levels of detail, I think there can be other approaches that are also fine. So I certainly lean. I agree with Councilmember Friedson's recommendation here. My concern about 105% utilization is ameliorated by using the seat deficit, so that I think that kind of ensures that it is more realistic as to when we're actually charging a fee that's going to be used, to address the problem that it is, that it's charged for. So, I feel better about that. So, I generally thinking. My general perspective on this whole SSP is that we've got to very broadly structurally realign this policy, and that it is an outdated approach that is holding this county back, and it's stopping us from getting a continually improving quality of life. And we put up as much of a barrier to investment as we can through these policies, and then we get what we ask for. We get a Rockville Pike that doesn't change. You get a downtown Silver Spring that takes hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to change. It's like the government can't do all this. We can't just finance everything. We've got to actually invite the private sector in to make changes in the world around us here. And when we have that, then we get a lot of benefits. And I just prefer all of the benefits that come from a constantly evolving, very dynamic economy. And I think we are more prosperous when we have that. And I think the path that we've been on for years has been one of, barriers and decline. And, I think everyone in this county, a lot of people are very concerned about the state of our development, and they look around us in the region and they see other communities that are, where the quality of life is higher. You just got more amenities, you get more, you get newer parks, you get newer, the new restaurants, you get, you have more walkable infrastructure, you get all these things that come when old stuff is replaced by new stuff. And we just don't get that very much anymore. There's very little development going on now in the county, and that creates an affordability problem, because housing is scarce. And I just think we've had this philosophy for years of, hey, let's, the development is going to overwhelm us, so let's tax it as heavily as we can. And I think that made sense when we were passing out 100-acre farms, left and right to turn into cul-de-sac developments. But I think now it's different, and what we want development to do has much more broad benefit. it has very broad benefit to redevelop. That's really what we want is redevelopment. And so under that circumstance, I just think we've got to charge as much as we can, but not too much. And I think the numbers speak for themselves as to, what the housing market is producing and how much redevelopment we're getting. So that's my overall philosophical posture. And I think the planning board's recommendation was very much aligned with that kind of thinking, that we have to juice the housing market here, or at least remove barriers to it, as well as actually get the master plans that we've envisioned. So I'm generally, supportive of that, but that's not to say that they're flawless and perfect and they can't be improved upon. And so, that's what we're going through here. So I support Councilmember Friedson's recommendation. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, thank you. I won't, snatch conflict from the jaws of consensus because I agree with the overarching philosophy, and I was just going to comment. I mean, I appreciate where Councilmember Jawando is coming. I do think the numbers do tell the story that the burden is too high. Currently, the idea that by doubling impact taxes or by charging a 50% premium at a relatively low level for impact taxes wouldn't matter. It already matters. The 100% currently of the impact tax, the current amount that we're charging, 120, that has generated only half the housing that we need. And we've been on a trajectory that at times has been even lower than that over the last 20 years. I mean, we are not building the type of housing that we need, that we all know that we want. We have some of the highest impact taxes anywhere in the region. Only Loudoun County competes with us, and in most places it's not even close in terms of what our impact taxes are. So, I do think that is a sensitivity that we need to think through as well. I mean, obviously this is about ensuring that we have the adequate public facilities, but we also need to understand that we have broader policy goals, and we are trying to thread the needle and balance that as well. I think this 2040-60 proposal does thread that needle. I also think remember the question of existing residents and their property taxes. Everybody's paying property taxes, and I agree that is part of the social contract. But impact taxes are not about that; they're about impact. And the new resident to be charged double when they're only generating one, or 50% premium when they're only generating one student, you are charging a new resident and benefiting an existing resident. And so, I mean, that is what impact taxes are designed to do. If we had a system where we only charged property taxes, that would be a true social contract where everybody pays in similarly, and a new resident and an existing resident are treated on equal grounds. Impact taxes are based on the premise that existing residents have a system, and a new resident is coming in to change that system, and they should have to pay their way in. It's a membership fee for the county, basically. It's a cost of entry. It's a barrier to entry. So the more we charge in impact taxes, the higher we make those thresholds, the more exclusive our county is, and the less inclusive the county is. I mean, that is what it is. We have something that's desirable here that people want to be a part of. And the question is, how much are we charging for people to get a piece of what we've got? And of course, we want to make sure that we're generating the revenues needed to keep the quality of life that we have, to maintain the great school system and the great parks and the libraries and all of the rec centers and the other services that we all enjoy. But we also don't want to make it so cost prohibitive that only a certain type of people can come in. So that's the balance that we've got to find here. I don't think there's one exclusive answer to how to reach it, but I just think the overarching thought process that we have to be really careful of is, jacking up these costs so high that they eliminate the housing that we need to create the type of community that we want. So appreciate the discussion and look forward to this recommendation.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, since you all took the opportunity to kind of turn this into a point about the larger effort, I feel like I need to say something in response. the premise, which I'm going to bring up at full council because it's not, it's not I think it's a better discussion to have there. The premise underlying many of these recommendations around, and the language that's being used, by everybody. And I just, Mr. Friedson said jacking up too high, the jacking up is high, right? So the double usage of jacking up and high, I think doesn't capture the story. We talked about this in the red policy areas last time. Development is happening where we want it to happen in the growth areas. And, you can debate that or not. I think the premise that our impact taxes are too high and that's why we're not getting development. I think there's some assumptions in there that are faulty that I'm going to probe at full council. I think what is really happening is that developers know how many high-priced multifamily units based on trend data and actually income data of residents, what they're making, and they hold the market back based on what they can collect. And I think the idea that it's just that they want to see an abundance of housing and prices go down, I think there's some faultiness in that argument. And I'm going to probe that in a deep way when we get to full council. But, so I understand where my colleagues are coming from, but I don't think those assumptions are necessarily true or fully accurate. And they're certainly not in light of the decisions we've made earlier. We've made other decisions that will lower the impact taxes, changing it from 120 to 100% of what we're collecting on. So the cumulative effect here is going to be lower. So the idea that in this specific policy where the school system would like some flexibility on what the rates are, the idea that this is going to just make them too high, I just don't think it's correct. So, I won't be supporting the proposal here just as a marker so we can continue the conversation. But I think there's we have to be careful about, nothing's happening and this is why we're doing this. And I don't know if the methodology and all the data points in that direction. So I'm going to try to fulfill that conversation and flush it out a little more later. But I think it's important to note here. So thank you.
Thanks. I think the comment you made there that we're getting development in the desired growth areas already, it echoes what the county executive has said. I don't disagree that what little development we're getting may be in areas that are more desired growth. That's not the point I'm making, though. The point I'm making is we're getting half of the housing that we used to get, and we're getting a lot less of the development that we want, that we need, that we envision. That's the problem I'm concerned about. And I think, in a weird way of thinking about it, it's like we also need adequate private facilities. Like we need to have housing, and housing is generally privately owned. And like Casey Anderson has made this point, like housing is infrastructure. Having an adequate supply of housing coming into the county is an essential public need. It may not be publicly provided, but it is a public need. And we have made that a very small priority and relative to other concerns. And it has consequences. And, when you don't have enough new housing, then the price goes up for everybody. And I think also when you make it so expensive to build housing, you eliminate the ability of developers to go after a more mid-market segment. And I think that's a problem. This is something we encountered in the calculations and learning about high-rise, is that basically in order to build a high-rise in this county, you have to be able to, first of all, get, if you don't have a subsidy, a significant tax benefit, you have to be able to get super premium rent. That's the state of the market in Montgomery County. Now, when we drive around this county, we see high-rises from an era past when we didn't have these massive costs on the upfront. When I drive up Veers Mill, there's some incredible high-rises all around Silver Spring. So many high-rises built in another era. Those high-rises are so important to our housing stock. The hundreds of thousands of people who have lived in those buildings over time and without them, where we would be today. But we have basically, I think, turned our back on that entire model of more mid-market, dense construction type, because we've made the cost so expensive. And now if you want to build something of that kind of scale, it's going to be a low rise on a massive lot, in a place where land is much cheaper, or it's going to be a super premium, high rise in downtown Bethesda. Nothing else is happening. Not a single high rise in this county has been built in the last 10 years that wasn't in downtown Bethesda, that didn't have a significant tax benefit, reduction in taxes that they pay. So I think we've got a fundamental market problem in the county. And if all we want is housing for people in downtown Bethesda, we could stay on the course that we're on. But if we want to open things up a bit and get the kind of broader housing resources that we used to have, that the rest of the county still relies upon, I think we got to make a change. And that's kind of what this policy is about.
Agree. We just think there's different changes that need to be made. So,
hey, appreciate that and respect your deeper engagement here. Okay, so all right. Well, I think we know where people are landing, but let's re-articulate what we've landed on. Andrew, did you want to explain?
Sure, we'd be setting the threshold at 105%. We'd be adding in the seat deficit, which was decision point 2, and the premium payments would be set at 20% at 105, 40% at 120, and 60% at 135.
Okay, so I'll support that. I think that's 2-1. Councilmember Joanna has his own proposal.
I just have to add, I think we'll have to come back to you, but we'll need to have seat deficits for 135. I don't think we have that, do we, Pam?
We do, yeah. I have them. I didn't print them in the report, but we have them. And as I said, they would just be consistent with starting at the numbers that were in the chart in the draft on, I think it's table 4. And they would just be increased by the same percentages as the utilization rate. And we'll have a chart for that. But I think you're agreeing to that philosophy, and therefore you're sort of agreeing to those numbers, and we'll make sure everything's consistent.
Yes, that's accurate. Thank you.
Okay. Having heard all that, I think that the next decision point is really we're going to move past table 11, and it's to really talk about how the funds for the payment should be spent. And for this, there will have to be text created that goes into Chapter 52. The old school facility payment language was all contained in the same chapter, but with its own section where we keep the information on development impact taxes. So to give the council the ability to collect these fees and to require them, that language will have to go there. So we'll have something drafted at the council. But part of that is not just okay, here's where we're collecting it, the percentages, and here's, at what thresholds, but then what can the fee be used for? And again, we did have that conversation that there should be, this is a fee and not an excise tax, more of a rational nexus to the reason for which the funds are being collected. And these are being collected when we see overutilization of school facilities. The school facility payment had a restriction where it had to have been spent within the cluster. They were also, adequacy was measured at the cluster, and we didn't have the individual school test, but it was cluster adequacy at a school level. So they were restricted to cluster level and school level. You could stay in that same vein. I would more strict. I wouldn't tie it to the school service area. That's too narrow. I know that MCPS is even concerned with tying it to the cluster. In fact, you could have a neighboring school service area that might alleviate something. It may not be in the same cluster, but it's the same school level. I think there's a little concern to just say school level, because then I think we broaden or we expand that level of nexus too far. I don't think that an elementary school, in Down County could be said to be alleviating any kind of overcrowding worry up in, Germantown. It just, that nexus is gone. So I'm just going to open this up for conversation about like what's the appropriate. Council staff had put in the bucket to make it school level and cluster, although I know that there's some concern about narrowing it to just cluster. Maybe there should be adjacent cluster, but I think you have to have some bound to it. It can't just be school level.
Okay, so I see you, Councilmember Friedson. I'll call you in a sec. Essie, what's your concern? Is it really I mean, I know in a perfect world you could do anything with the funding anywhere, and I wish we, of course we all wish we could do that, but this is a policy where we have to have this nexus issue. So how much of a concern do you have about council staff's recommendation?
And so really understanding that it's not endlessly flexible, certainly appreciate that. Our thought really is that, and I believe that the committee, if I remember correctly, made a similar recommendation last time, which was to look at adjacent schools not only in the cluster. And so really all we were saying is, rather than say same level, same cluster, could we say same level in the same cluster or an adjacent school or adjacent school catchment area? Again, the idea being that sometimes, as we had discussed, there might be a school closer by. In fact, I know we use this example a lot, but we're building at Dufeef Elementary to alleviate Rachel Carson. Those are in different clusters, but they're literally across 28 from each other. So that is the kind of example that I think would be helpful to be able to say it's not restricted to the same cluster, but understanding the adjacency as perhaps the key factor.
Okay, so Pam, okay, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering, I mean, I agree with all of the points that have been made. I'm wondering if the policy can talk about a direct nexus to the overcrowding, and that could include adjacency if that is going to alleviate, but it would require that the school system would be making a change that, subsequent to that funding decision that actually does address the overcrowding. I think by making it too restrictive, we defeat the purpose, which is how do we generate revenue to solve the problem? That's the whole point. And so we want to give some flexibility to be able to do that, but we don't want to give so much flexibility like with impact taxes that we say that the point of impact taxes is to, pay for the impact, but it really doesn't necessarily pay for the impact exactly in the community where the impact is being felt. So, I mean, I think that there's a balance here, and, I think that a direct nexus is what we're looking for. I'm not sure what the legal mechanism is for that, but we should provide an ability for there to be adjacency and for there to be some flexibility with the facilities that the school system has to help address the problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
If I could pitch in here on the school facility payment, when we had it, this issue was there as well. And the idea for the school facility payment was the goal is that the money had to be used to relieve capacity for the service elementary school or middle school service area that was being affected by the development. That could mean either building an addition or a new school in that area, or it didn't happen very often, but Essie's right. It did happen a couple times where there was an elementary school in the adjacent cluster and it physically abutted the elementary school service area in the first cluster. And the plan for the Board of Education was to build that addition and do a boundary change, reallocate students across clusters. And so it certainly would fit into the spirit of at least what school facility payment was. And I see this as being very similar to do that. I mean, maybe we could, this is just a suggestion. I know we said and I'm glad Bessie brought this up, rather than say requiring to spend the money at the school level in the school cluster, maybe require it to be spilled in the school level, in the school cluster or the adjacent service area. The point is that so that it relieves that, we'll look for good language, to relieve the congestion.
Can't we just say that it's a project that directly relieves in the school cluster, in the school
service area?
The school service area that's over. So
yeah, I think that'd be a way of saying it.
What is because if the money is spent in another adjacent or abutting service area, but it's directly addressing as part of the project. I mean, the PDFs describe that like this is not abnormal. I mean, Woodward High School is addressing Walter Johnson. The funding is not going to an addition at Walter Johnson. It's specifically going to Woodward High School. Northwood High School is, the Down County Consortium. I mean, you don't have to spend, the money at a project at one of those schools, but you are addressing the overcrowding at all of those schools. The same thing with Walter Johnson. Can't we just write it about the, directly, alleviating the crowd? I mean, we want to directly address the problem, but we don't want to be so restrictive that we don't have all the tools at our disposal in order to do it.
Right. I totally agree.
And I think, and I just would add that I think adjacent, I think relieving the capacity also allows for the fact that, again, there can be, I mean, your Down County example, Mr. Friedson, is a good one, where there are a number of high school areas involved, and there could be some leapfrogging and some dominoes to make all those numbers work out. And until we really look at all those areas together and understand how to reconfigure them, we wouldn't want to prejudge what we should do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think finding a way to create the terminology that directly addresses a direct nexus to address the school overcrowding.
I think you have to have it a little more discreet than that in the code, though. And from what I'm hearing, I don't think you're all too far off if you were to say the school level. I think we all agree that you have to have it as elementary, it stays elementary, within the cluster or an adjacent school service area that's at the same school level. I mean, that gives MCIPS the flexibility that you've just mentioned with respect to the high schools. It doesn't deviate from it so greatly that people would say, well, there's no nexus between the fact that this is literally a fee and a tax.
But couldn't you say a project that directly addresses the school service area and the school level? Doesn't have to be a project that actually funds a school in that service area specifically. Right. It could be an elementary school, that to the point that Ms. McGuire was making, sometimes the domino pieces fit as they will. I mean, I think that is discrete because that would change the student population at a school if there's a boundary change or if there's some other capacity at the adjacent school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's.
Because how would you address the consortium issue with high school? I mean, that is one of the things that I was thinking about.
And that's where I think adjacent, I realized that I said this initially, but I think adjacent service area might be too restrictive to that point, because again, there could just be other configurations, consortia, et cetera, adjacent cluster or adjacent. I mean, if we broaden that a little bit, or as you're saying, just tie it to the relief.
Yeah, I think it should be
tied to when we have a new project.
Yeah. Can we tie it to the relief? Is that
it should be tied to the relief that we want? I mean, that's I mean, it doesn't matter where the money is spent as long as the problem is solved. So why wouldn't we tie the discrete requirement to solving the discrete problem?
Okay, I was confused about the wording, so now I get it.
Great. Okay, I'd be comfortable.
I think we'd have to be careful. We'd have to, on the PDFs and this is really for Essie, on the PDFs for the school projects, we'd have to affirmatively say that this project will relieve the capacity at, the school we're talking about where the utilization payment's being made to be able to use utilization payment funds on that project.
And so I think, that's an important point, and I do know that we wind up sometimes in the chicken and egg where the board can't predict the outcome of a boundary study it hasn't initiated, but it can indicate the scope of that boundary study. And so if we say, this project, I'm thinking the Crown project, for example, that's in the CIP now, is referenced in multiple clusters where we intend to do that analysis. Again, the board can't prejudge, well, we're going to take 100 kids from here and 200 kids from here or whatever until we do that work. But they can say, we intend to address the situation in these areas. That's what we can say in the PDFs and do currently.
I think it can work out because if it depends on how fast we want to spend this money. First of all, this is not going to be a lot of money. Any more money is good, but it's not going to be a lot of money. The board usually makes its decisions about boundary changes, about a year or so before the school opens?
Mm-hmm.
So that we could effectively, and you know, Mary's listening on this too, we could effectively use this money if it has to wait that long, not program it until that last year. And it still saves us GO bonds or state aid on the project. It just means it's not used at the front end, it's used at the back end, but it's still going to be used. And that way we maintain the nexus. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, if I could chime in here to Ms. McGuire's point, and I think the point that Councilmember Friedson is making too. If you look at the Crown PDF today, it says that that new school will relieve overcrowding at Quince Orchard High School and Richard Montgomery High School. And so if what I'm hearing is the way that if a utilization premium payment was collected for Richard Montgomery or Quince Orchard, then it could be used to pay for Crown, because the Crown PDF specifically says that that project is intended to relieve the overcrowding at those two schools.
And remember,
Makes sense.
The way that we're changing this is not like moratorium. It doesn't have to relieve it to 693 students in order for us to get out of moratorium. It just has to send the money to a place that has a direct nexus to solving the problem. And so we get out of this crippling situation that we've had where the school system intends to relieve overcrowding at a place like Walter Johnson with the opening of Woodward, but can't commit to an exact student count because they haven't redone the boundaries yet. We're totally out of that, really difficult conversation, because it's not about a discrete number that has to be committed to in order to, lift an arbitrary thing like moratorium in order to proceed. So, I think we already have our paradigm is so focused on how moratorium works that it's hard for us to even fathom how this will work. But I think it's much simpler than we are making it out to be, because we have eliminated this, assuming it goes through full council, we will have eliminated, based on the recommendation of the joint committees, this major challenge that created all of these unintended consequences.
All right. So I know Mary Beck has a comment or question, and then we have one more issue.
Yeah, I realized that I had a question that had not occurred to me until I read the packet and was looking at something that Glenn had written on page 12 about transportation. Are the UPPs not applicable in exempted areas? Are they, or are they? Because there was a reference to payments in lieu of mitigation in the transportation context that was recommended to apply for non-exempted, at the non-exempted percentages of impact taxes. And I know, like Viva White Oak, we got about 1,100 kids estimated to be generated. And I'm not used to this model anymore. We haven't had school facility payments for a while. So what is the assumption with regarding the premium payments? Would they apply in enterprise zones, or is 60% of 0?
Jason?
Sure. I can address what the planning board had proposed. The planning board had recommended, I believe, only exempting those utilization premium payments for senior housing and MPDUs. And in every other case, it would still apply. And I believe that's I can let Ms. Dunn address that. But I think when we've referred to, or when they've referred to the unexempted or undiscounted, that was just to say, here's the rate that is used to calculate it, that it's the base impact tax rate is how we calculate it. Where it applies and the exemption, I believe the only exemption would still be senior housing and MPDUs.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, let's keep going here. We got one more issue with this, then we'll move on to transportation.
Can I just ask one quick question? Make sure that the last piece where the money toward a project to relieve overcrowding is 30 on that.
Yeah, I was going to ask too. I was going to ask for it to be restated so I could chime in. I think I think I followed it, and that I know so could someone just restate exactly what we're doing?
Pam,
what's your understanding? Since you have to
my
write it.
understanding is that rather than having the money restricted by a certain school service area, geography, cluster, that it will be used on a project that will alleviate over utilization in the school, for the area from which it was collected. So it may show up in an adjacent cluster, it may show up 2 clusters over, but it's going to be spent on a project that alleviates the overutilization of the school area for which it was collected.
Right.
School level and school level.
At the same school level.
Yeah, that's it.
So yeah, so not relate. So it has elementary to elementary, middle to middle, high to high,
Correct.
but it could be outside of the cluster depending on how it. Yeah. So
Yes.
okay. All right. I'm fine. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
3-0.
Yes, so now we move to the last piece of the school utilization premium payments. And it was in the planning board draft, the language implied that at the time of the annual school test, the fee would be collected. That's customary. Impact taxes are collected at building permit. And sometimes based on economic conditions that gets delayed to use and occupancy, there can be changes to that down the road. But for the most part, impact taxes get paid at building permit. Utilization premium payment would be paid at building permit. They had a further provision that said that it would be paid based on the annual school test in effect at building permit. And that is essentially another APFO test. If an applicant moves to building permit and then the amount they get, they have to pay. And this also was phrased in that it would be it would apply to ones that had the payment as a condition of their preliminary plan approval. So that was the first part. You go through your approval process, the board approves you. They look at the annual school test. If the payment is at that moment in time through the annual school test said, yes, you're asking for this subdivision in this area where utilization payments required. Therefore, a condition of your approval is you will make that payment at building permit. Then they say when you get to building permit, we relook at the annual school test. And if the payment no longer applies, at that date, you no longer have to make the payment. And I have a couple concerns with that, and so we can talk this through. And one concern is it's only applying in one direction. Because if you were to go to the board and at the date you got your approval, there was no payment required, you would have no condition related to that as a condition of approval. And you'd go to building permit and no one would say, oh, well, you have this as a condition of approval. Let's see how it holds today. You didn't have it, you wouldn't be retested. And maybe at that point in time, at that building permit, it would be required from that annual school test. So we should treat everyone the same. But if that's the case, I have a real issue with why you would retest at building permit. One, it's another APFO test. It should be clearly stated that it's another APFO test. It is not simply somebody at the counter looking at an annual school test. That's just an issue. That's a concern. The other is, at that point in time, do we really think that they're 4 years from, the window when we think these children will hit the school? The reason why we picked the 4-year projection, and it was tied to when the planning board made approval, was on average, that's when we think students will be actually accessing our school facilities. We're now doing a second APFO test related to schools, and we're doing it at building permit. Well, we know we're much closer than 4 years. And you've lost the connection. You're saying now we're going to care that you're going to put kids in there sooner, but we're going to look at this annual school test that isn't based on that. I'm just very confused. I personally think it should just be something that's determined when you get your approval. Are you required to make the payment or aren't you? And then if you are, when you get to building permit, you make the payment.
Let's hear from planning. Jason,
Sure. Yeah. So, for the planning board, this was really an attempt to try to kind of balance certainty for the developer with what the true conditions are at the time that they're moving forward with construction. It was something that the board kind of deliberated back and forth on a bit. I think Ms. Dunn's point is fairly valid that it would only apply to those. It is somewhat like a retest at the point of building permit, but it would only apply to those that had been approved at the time when the utilization premium payments existed. So, it's really basically a call, whether you want to provide a little bit more certainty to the developer, which is what you would do if you say at approval, the utilization premium payment applies, here's where it applies, and it applies in your case, so here's what you have to pay, then that's, then you would want to agree with council staff. But if you wanted to say, well, we want it to be based more on what exists at the time that you go forward, then you would want to go with the planning board recommendation.
All right. Well, council staff's comments make some sense to me, but let's hear what my colleagues say. Andrew.
Yeah, I'm a little, so the question, there's kind of two questions here, it sounds to me. One is whether or not there'll be a retest, and two, what is charged at the time of the building permit. Is that correct, Ms. Dunn?
So, right, I would say under the planning board's proposal, it would be a retest. I like I said, I don't agree with that. You always pay the rate that is in effect when you go to get your building permit. That's always been the case with impact taxes. It was the case with school facility payments. Development community pretty much knows that these things can change over the course of their approval time. They get updated every 2 years based on construction cost indices. And so there can be some, they usually factor that in. Okay, we're going to now, maybe we're not going to pull our building permit for 3 or 4 years. The price for this will probably go up some. We did have in the past, though, after the last recession, the rates went down. Impact tax rates went down based on the fact that the construction costs fell. But the development community is aware of that. That's something that they've always been used to, that the rates, and it is then the rate that's in effect the day they get their building permit.
But the utilization premium payment would not necessarily vary if we charged it, if it was assessed at the time of preliminary plan, right? That's what you're saying?
No, I would say that the rate can still change. It's just the condition of whether you need to pay it or not, right? Those are two different things. So
the rate could change if the council changes the rate, but you'll be assessed one, is that right?
Yes, it is whether or not you get assessed a rate, right? And the rate.
We also don't want to retest. I mean,
no.
If you retest the challenge that I have is if you're going to say you're retesting, then retesting those who were required to pay an up, you probably should then retest those who weren't required to pay an up to see if they have to pay an up.
Right.
And that really adds significant uncertainty in the process, which I think is, counter to the whole purpose of structuring it the way that we are. So I would be more comfortable personally. I think that opens up Pandora's box to a certain extent and, creates a compelling argument for why wouldn't you retest everybody, which really could throw a wrench into the county's planning, the school system's planning, and the development process for the private sector. And I don't think anybody wins in that scenario. So I think creating the certainty on the front end, setting whether or not you have to pay the up, and then going to the building permit and determining whatever the rate is at that time is what you pay, as council staff has suggested, seems to be the most appropriate path forward. I'd be the most comfortable with that. I think it's the most consistent with the certainty that we're trying to provide and would make things simpler for everybody.
You're here. Councilmember Duano?
So you're saying with the council staff's recommendation?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
All right. Okay. Very good.
That's moving now. You are now moving toward the motor vehicle adequacy test mitigation priorities. And then the last piece will be the name. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Orland.
Thank you. And I hate to do this. Pam's going to kill me again. Mary raises a very good point, and back on the utilization payment about who's exempt. And I'm not sure if we've covered that, but Jason's correct. The planning board's recommendation is to exempt senior housing and affordable housing from the payment. I think senior housing, it's moot because I believe this impact tax for senior housing is still zero. Isn't that correct? Okay, so it's a moot point on senior housing. It's not a moot point on affordable housing. When it's a fee, you're talking about how many students is housing generating. And when school system does its forecast of how many employees, here we go, students who are generated by a development, whether it's 105%, 108%, whatever, it's figuring in students from market rate and affordable units. And I believe what we did under the school facility payment, they were not exempt from, the affordable housing was not exempt from school facility payments. Same thing's true with traffic mitigation on the transportation side. And I'm glad Mary brought the argument up because it frankly didn't occur to me until just now. So I think that we would be charging school facility payments on developments that have affordable housing, which is everyone, not just the market rate units, but also the affordable units, to be able to march with the fee idea. But Pam and I haven't talked about this. I'm sorry, we're doing this in real time.
Okay, well, we probably can't do this in the moment. We may have.
Okay, all right. Well,
Can I ask a point of clarification though on that? I mean, if
we'll need to come
the
back
whole
to it.
basis of what we're recommending here is a percentage off of the impact taxes that are being charged.
I don't
If the
think we
impact
charge.
tax is zero, I mean, I'm not a math wizard, but 40% of zero is zero.
Right.
And that's the
That's
problem.
right.
Yeah,
So,
your
I mean,
math,
my understanding, based on what we've done, it would be zero. But
It's true,
Yeah.
but I'm saying that's the problem. I mean,
Yeah.
the problem
Well,
is that
I-
the problem that was pointed out for the transportation side as well, is that when you're paying a fee to meet a test, it's not the same thing as the tax.
well,
We'll have to
but
research.
let's
I
walk-
still don't think they collected it on MPDUs.
Okay, well,
Right.
we'll go back and look at that.
It was not collected on MPDUs.
Jason?
and if I could just respond to Councilmember Friedson, that I think the way we've worded the utilization premium payment amount, it's based on the unexempted, undiscounted rate that would be applicable. So, that would be the $19,000 rate. That's what we use, impact tax. That's what we use, even if you're exempt because of some other reason.
Did the planning board propose that the utilization premium payment would apply in opportunity zones where
Yes.
impact taxes do not apply?
Yeah, and in fact, I'm looking at what we had said here was that the only exemptions from the UPP would be, legacy development projects that received their approval prior to the adoption of this policy, and
Right.
then MPDUs. We didn't address the senior housing actually because the senior housing rate is zero. So
Right.
calculating off of zero
So
as
there is, the planning board's recommendation is that these utilization premium payments would apply where impact taxes are exempted in general with the qualifications that have been mentioned. And we'll decide if we need to bring that back to full committee or to the committee to discuss or not. If council staff did not surface that as an issue that we would want to discuss, doesn't mean we can't. So we'll talk about that, and we'll certainly, if we decide that we basically agree and we don't need to weigh in on it specifically because we agree, it will be clearly in the council packet, but we could come back to it if we feel we need to. Andrew.
Yeah, it sounds like there's two different issues here. I mean, one is the opportunity zones. That is a big question. I mean, I think that is something, if we were to go counter to what the planning board had recommended, I'm not suggesting that we are. The other is, the suggestion, at least that I heard, was affordable housing like MPDUs. And, I don't think that it was ever, I never heard it being the intention to charge UPPs on MPDUs, not
So
affordable housing.
We'll research it, so we'll get back to it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, for something completely different.
How many students are generated intersections?
There you go. Exactly. Okay.
Well, those students need a safe place to cross the street. I will point that out.
Okay. Okay, as you know, shifting back into the transportation world, this SSP has 4 and will have eventually 5 local air review tests, motor vehicle, bicycle, pedestrian, transit, and eventually a safety test. And all of them have to be met because they're each testing each of these different modes in the case of safety, just overall safety. And the planning board says that affirmatively in the SSP, that all of them have to be met. But then it goes on to talk about, well, if the motor vehicle test fails or is failing, what is it that can be done to mitigate it? And they are recommending in the SSP putting in discrete priorities. Like, what do you do first? that doesn't work, what do you do second, et cetera. Their first priority is doing transportation demand management. Can you reduce the demand? So can that solve the problem? If that doesn't do enough, then the next step they're saying is for allow the developer to make a payment in lieu of mitigation. It doesn't really say about what the size of that mitigation is, what is it, but it says make a payment. And then the third priority would be intersection operational improvements. And what we're talking about here are changing traffic signal timing or changing lane assignments. And what I mean by lane assignments, actually a perfect example is one right near where Mr. Friedson lives. On Rockville Pike and Jones Bridge Road heading southbound, it's 3 through lanes and a left turn lane at that point. Most of the time there's 1 left turn lane and 3 through lanes, but in the PM peak, that the left side, one of the 3 lanes is also a left turn lane. So it becomes a double left and 2 through lanes. That's what we mean by lane assignment, lane reassignment. It doesn't change the cross section of the intersection, but it changes how it's used. That's what we mean by operational improvements. There would be other things similar to that, things that don't involve really any construction. And then the last priority would be actual construction, whether you're adding a turn lane or more at an intersection or a through lane. And furthermore, the board is saying that if there's any way that the motor vehicle test solution interferes with either the bike or the pedestrian or the transit solution, or the safety solution for that fact, whenever it's put together, then basically a payment can be made and that's enough. What I'm saying is under that regime of priority, we're almost never going to see an actual road improvement or even an operational improvement by a developer, because you don't even get that far. You get to the point of just making a payment of some kind, and they'll make that payment and that'll be it. And that does, I think, a real disservice to the folks who are going to have to continue to drive. The other options really aren't options for them. Remember the discussion about the non-auto driver mode share. Except in metro station policy areas, and not even all of them, the ultimate non-auto driver mode share is either in the low 40s or in the 30s or in the 20s of percentages. The flip side of that, those are people driving. And so what we're saying in a place like Fairland, 73% at build-out will be driving, 73 to 75% in Germantown, 78% in Olney. And of course today, those percentages are even higher because there's really not much in the way of transit options out there by pedestrian. So my recommendation is the following. For the orange, yellow, and green areas, you don't have a priority for, well, you do have a priority. You have a priority for the highway mobility test. One is you do transportation demand management first. That should always be the first thing. Secondly, the intersection operational improvements, the things that don't involve construction. That should be second. And then if those two things don't work, then you look at all of the tests and you look at them holistically. The bike test, the pedestrian test, the transit test, and the roadway test. And you see what optimizes all of those tests. You don't strictly say, oh, if there's any interference with the bikeway test, that you can't do something that the bikeway test wouldn't allow, or not 100% of what would allow, to allow the roadway to be improved. The exception I have to that would be in the red areas, and this would only apply if the majority of the council frankly disagrees with the majority of the committee. Because remember, in the majority of the committee said we won't have a motor vehicle test in red areas. But should the council decide that there should be one or continue to do it, whether it's 120 seconds per vehicle or not, then I would recommend that the first two priorities would be the same: demand management first, then operational improvements next. And the third priority, and only in that case, would there be a mitigation payment rather than doing an improvement, because in the red areas is where you see your most intense walking and biking activity. And I'm recommending that be charged equal to 50% surcharge on the undiscounted and unexempted impact tax. And this is what raised Mary's eyes in terms of thinking about this, the school tax, the school facility payment. And that money must be used for other roadway or intersection capacity improvements, either in that same red area or in the adjacent policy area, which is usually an orange area. DOT's reaction to it was they would like to see, I mean, they'll talk about their whole point of view on this, but I do want to point out that if there is a situation where there is a test in red areas and there is a surcharge, that they would like to see that money be used not necessarily for roadway and intersection capacity improvements or operational improvements, but for anything that's transportation related, such as a bikeway sidewalk. And my point is really those things really don't address the problem of the motor vehicle test. We have separate tests for those. So I would disagree with that. But anyway, that's my recommendation. DOT, I think, did want to chime in on this. Of course, planning
Definitely
board
want to hear from. Yes,
Yeah,
I think we
thanks.
should hear from everybody in turn. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. So first of all, as you said, Glenn, we've already recommended that there won't be these tests in the red policy areas. So the improvements that you ascribe to red policy areas would only come into play if the full council came to a different
that's
decision.
correct.
I feel like we should address that. We should address. I would hate to have the council also have to figure out this issue if they go in that direction, because that could take a lot of time at the full council. But I wanted to just make sure I understand. So let's say it's all based on trips, right? So let's say a building is going up and they're going to generate 150 peak hour trips. And would it be the case that, okay, through TDM, they've managed to address, 100 of them, and then there's still 50 that are exceeding the test threshold limit, and then you go to operational improvements, and okay, now you've taken care of 25 of them, and now you still got 25 that are unresolved, and so the third priority would be a payment. Now, is that a payment based on that 25% remaining trips in your model of the red area? And I think this will generally apply to the other areas too, but or because of the 25% remaining trips, it's the whole impact tax that is now surcharged.
I would say it's the whole, but I understand your point. That's a nuance. I mean, if you to go in that direction, I would see what you're saying. It makes it more complicated. But recall also that the transportation impact tax in red areas are very small. So a 50% increase. For example, the red areas rates for transportation are 60% less.
Right. I was just really trying to understand
than
how it
orange.
works, first and foremost.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to understand what the role of the TDM is in all of this. And so, the first point is that TDM will mitigate a certain number of trips that will be decided during the development review process. Right. And that applies to both red and then non-red areas. And then intersectional operational improvements will mitigate an additional share of trips. And then, you're saying in the red areas, rather than mandate additional roadway capacity, you can see that we don't want to do that. You would levy a particular charge. And then you say in the red and green areas, or the other, non-red areas, you want to see roadway capacity improvements would be required, but only if I'm sort of unclear. Your third priority, roadway capacity improvements would be required, but only if all of the tests are optimized. How do those two things interact?
What I was saying is that what the planning board was saying was that if there's any interference with what the bike test or with, and I know I'm talking about the orange, yellow, and green areas now, okay, solely.
Yeah.
What they're saying is that if there is any interference with the result of the bike test or the transit test or the PHED test or the safety test. And you can't solve that. You can't do a road improvement that would touch any of those. And I'm saying, no, I'm recommending that not be the
try
case.
to do your best with all of them, but you have to do roadway capacity and try to do your best with all of them.
Right, which means you don't necessarily get all the roadway capacity either. But it's not strictly, you do the first 4 tests and then whatever's sort of left over, but roadway capacity can fit in and not interfere with those 4 can be done.
Okay, I think I understand your proposal now. Thank you.
It ends up being soft.
I want to hear DOT.
Just to clarify, if I may, we're only talking about the roadway test and the mitigation priority for the roadway test. We have other issues dealing with TDM, with transit, with pedestrians and safety. This is only only dealing with failure of the roadway test, the LATR part. And then the issue then is, can you do more TDM? Can you go maybe above your non-auto driver mode share? Can you do more towards that program to reduce the roadway impacts? Or can you do operational improvements such as Glenn talked about, signal coordination, lane assignments? Or do you really need to make some physical improvements to the roadway infrastructure? Our point is that we just want to be neutral in terms of mode capacity. We don't necessarily want to build a roadway project. We'd like to be able to take the money and do the best project that gives us the adequacy that we need.
Okay, so generally speaking, I think what you just described sounds good to me, but that's my starting point here, Carrie. Thank you. All right, my colleagues, Andrew.
We're not neutral in the county. We've adopted Vision Zero, and we have made significant policy decisions to say that road capacity and expanding roads as a primary vehicle, for lack of a better term, or a primary mechanism to address issues in the roadway system is not the approach that we want to take. And respectfully to Dr. Orland and to DOT here, if we adopt that type of approach, it would be inconsistent with Vision Zero. And it would be inconsistent with everything that we have been talking about when it comes to how to address our roadways. And frankly, it would be very similar to a very large state project that many council members have expressed concern with. And I 100% on this one, and I don't think there's a lot of ambiguity here, support the planning board recommendation. And I would have real concerns if we didn't use road capacity as the last resort. It's not saying you can't ever expand a road. You can't ever create new capacity. It's saying before you do that, you should try every other option. And that is literally what we've been trying to shift our thinking, our engineering, our road design based on. So I'm a bit confused as to how this is in any way consistent with all of the other decisions that we've made, how this is even remotely a Vision Zero policy. And I'm real concerned about the fact that we would be making capacity, which is expansion of roads, addition of turn lanes, significant issues for pedestrians and to a certain extent, perhaps sometimes a lesser extent, bicyclists, but certainly to pedestrians, a significant negative. And what we have said before is that's not what we want to do. We want to create roadways for all users. We want to create safety as a key component to road design. If we do this, we will fall back into the trap that we've always been on, where our road tests are almost exclusively based on throughput, on the speed at which cars go through intersections. And if that's the case, then we put other users at risk. And that is completely counter to everything else that we've tried to do. I understand the point here, but I just very strongly, very vehemently disagree. And I would very much hope that we approve the planning board recommendation and we stay consistent with all of the commitments that we've made at this committee, at the T&E committee that the chair serves on, and at the full council on our Vision Zero progress.
All right, let's hear from planning board.
I'd like to.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So I just want to understand the two positions. As I read in the packet, this would be a prioritization, not a, this isn't eliminating this. Every prioritization, even proposed by you, Dr. Orland, as I read it, says that we want transportation demand management as the first priority to reduce vehicular demand. That is the number one priority. Is that correct? And you both agree on that, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then you would go to the next, you know, where the divergence is you put as priority number 2, the intersectional improvements, correct?
The operational
improvements. And then, so to DOT, Gary, just explain to me the difference between the two approaches. I want to make sure I'm clear on it, and then I have a comment.
I don't think we disagree about making operational improvements the second priority, and that we need to reduce demand first, or get people out of their cars, and reduce vehicular demand. I think the issue is really, dealing with what's involved in the roadway improvement and where that is and what that money can be spent for. But I don't think Glenn and the department we don't have a difference in the priority of the operational improvements being set.
Got it. You're just worried about what you would, on the roadway improvements, how that money would be
spent. Yes, we would like it to be mode neutral, so that if there are bike facilities or pedestrian facilities, we have the ability to spend the money there because it's getting some people out of their cars. It is supporting the TDM, some of the TDM goals that we would have,
which would be consistent with the prioritization of the TDM goals. Jason, you can say something. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would just make clear that what Dr. Orland has recommended, his prioritization doesn't actually say that you weigh and balance the other tests, and it just says that the roadway capacity improvements is priority number 3. In those orange, yellow, and green areas, there's actually no option for the board to even collect the payment if they find that the roadway capacity improvements don't work. And so the discussion over how we use the money wouldn't even apply under what Dr. Orland has proposed. But I can also channel my best, Chairman Anderson, if unless Council Member Jawanda, I don't want to take your time.
Yeah, I want you to speak, but let me just finish. Yeah. So, and then Dr. Orland, to that point of not allowing a payment, you make the point in the packet, and you made it today, and you point out my neighborhood, Fairland, Colesville. You know, even under the most rosy of scenarios, you have a lot of people driving, right? And even if you improve things to the point where we want to, and I am totally in favor of that. I remember when I did the transit challenge, you know, I used to get rib my colleague, Councilmember Friedson, who could roll downstairs and hop in the metro and get to work in 20 minutes, even though he's much further away from Rockville. It would take me sometimes an hour and a half, 2 hours on the bus to get there. And so we certainly
took the bus too, even 2 buses sometimes.
You did.
I had more options. That is certainly true. I had more options and more efficient options.
Exactly. And so, and when I took the bus, I pointed this out at the time. There were many people that said, you know, at the bus stop, I think this is something we forget, and particularly for people of color and immigrant, they were like, yeah, I want to get a car. You know, like I'm trying to get to a car. I think oftentimes we try to squeeze people into a box of let's make a bike lane and think that everyone's going to do it. I'm all for it. I'm big time for Vision Zero. But the way we are situated in Montgomery County with our topography and our geography, the idea that we're not going to have large amounts of people driving is just not true. And I think we just have to be honest about that and how we approach these things. That doesn't mean we don't keep it as a top priority, that we don't protect and have complete streets, but we have to acknowledge at some point that we're just the reality of where we are, even under the rosiest situation. So I think that's important, but I do want Glenn to respond, and then we can turn to planning on why don't you include an opportunity for a payment at all? You think that will just given out that there will be nothing ever considered? And can you just explain that a little more?
Yeah, typically, this goes back to the idea of what inadequate public facilities are. The degree that you require a developer to make improvements versus making a payment. In the other tests, in the bikeway test, for example, you said that they have to build a certain number of, depending on where you are, a certain number of bikeways if it's insufficient in the area. If DOT and Planning Board agree that a particular section of that is not practicable, then they can pay a mitigation payment. I would want the same idea applied to this test, which is that there are a lot of places in the county where you can do intersection improvements. And I have to very much 180 degree disagree with the statement that was made earlier that somehow capacity improvements are counter to Vision Zero. They're not the same thing at all. Speed is counter to Vision Zero, not capacity. Okay. So
what is the test based off that the capacity would be quote unquote improving, just as a point of clarification?
It reduces the delay at an intersection. It doesn't increase the speed of the vehicle going through it. Right. But anyway, that's my point, Mr. Joando, is that it basically should treat each of these tests as co-equals, as the Planning Board says at the beginning of the statement. They have to meet all these tests. Perhaps not treating them as co-equals in the red areas where there is a very high predominance of people walking and biking, but in other parts of the county where the overwhelming percentage of people now and even in the future will be driving not by choice, by need, sure, that there be a chance for their problems to be met, and still following the other priorities first, TDM first, operational improvements next, and only as the last resort, build a master planned roadway or intersection improvement. Right, and these are in the master plan.
I appreciate that, and I think I would agree with the Department of Transportation at this point as far as the flexibility of that money. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, I want to hear more from the Planning Board, but I still want to better understand this TDM aspect, right? The first priority in both of these cases, wherever it is supposed to be reducing trips.
Yeah.
And that, how does that play out? Like, doesn't infrastructure come into play with that?
No, not necessarily. I'm sorry.
Well,
what's happened historically is a developer comes in, he has a traffic study, and it says that as a result of the study, and Park and Planning reviews it for make sure it's correct, they'll identify where it doesn't meet the motor vehicle test, is what we're calling it now. The first priority would be, can you do a traffic mitigation program, whether it's buying down transit fares or carpool programs or anyone running the shuttle buses, whatever you can do to reduce the demand from your development and maybe even from developments that are existing that are nearby, so that the net result on those intersections is that they're not made worse, or at least they don't exceed the intolerable standard. The standard that says it's intolerable. It's not an intolerable standard. That's what the first priority would be. But if doing as much as reasonably can be done under TDM doesn't get you all the way there, then the next step would be, is there anything you can do to the intersection in terms of changing the signal timing, changing the lane assignment? There may be some other things as well that don't change the construction, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically doesn't move the curbs, doesn't really change anything physically on the ground having to do with the intersection that would make it operate more efficiently. If those two things don't work, then in the orange, yellow, and green area, then improvement, actual construction would be allowed, but taking it into account that there is a bikeway test, a transit test, a pedestrian test, and make sure that if try to optimize all of those tests. In other words, you may not get to 100% of what you want on all of those tests, but you're treating them all as equals. In that, and you look at it holistically, is what I'm saying. And there isn't so there wouldn't be a prioritization amongst those four. And safety overrides everything. I mean, everything that we design, everything comes out of DRC or out of DOT and planning board is safe. Okay, there's no question. It's always been safe. The idea is that we have continuing tighter and tighter definitions of what safety mean, which is good.
All right, I'd like to hear from the planning board. I see Jason and Gwen.
Well,
I know
so-
Casey's in.
Yeah, I will. Could I jump in here if you could? I don't know if you can hear me because I'm.
Yeah,
We can.
I just think it is not correct to say that intersection quote unquote improvements, which are designed to make cars move faster, are not damaging to the level of service and convenience and safety of pedestrians, because in practice it usually means widening the road. And if you think about what's happened out in Great Seneca Science Corridor, that would be illustrative of the extreme case where you have, a roadway that takes multiple light cycles for someone to cross from one side of the intersection to the other. And if you need to cross two streets, you may be waiting through several light cycles just to cross all the turn lanes and as well as the through lanes of traffic. The other issue is even operational improvements. Everybody's talking about operational improvements like those never come at the expense of pedestrians either. That's not true either. If typically operational improvements often include things like changes in the signal timing. Changing the signal timing to do what? Make the light cycle work to move the cars more quickly, which often means that pedestrians have less time to cross the street. So I think that the picture Dr. Orland has painted is not entirely accurate, because not in every case, but in many cases, even these operational improvements will interfere with Vision Zero and the safety and convenience of pedestrians. I could not agree more with Councilmember Friedson, which is if the council believes what it has said to us for the last couple of years now, and Vision Zero is the priority, then we believe that our prioritization scheme embodies the direction that the council has set to put human life and the pedestrians, bicycles first. And the last point I'd want to make to Councilmember Joando is all of us are pedestrians. Every single person who drives a car has to walk to the car or across the parking lot to get there. And so while it's true that some of us ride bicycles or take the bus or use other modes of transportation more frequently, every single one of us depends on safety of pedestrian facilities in order to go about our business, including getting in our cars so we can drive where it is that we're going. So we emphatically believe this prioritization scheme is absolutely not just consistent with, but required by Vision Zero.
Yeah. So if I could kind of build on that, I would say, what we're basically saying is the county has made a commitment to Vision Zero. And that means, and what we've said is that means we value human life and safety above all other roadway priorities, even if it means accepting higher levels of congestion to protect only a small handful number of pedestrians in areas where the NADMS goal might only be 20%, right? It still doesn't matter. We're saying human life, all roadway users' safety is more important than the congestion. And so incorporating Vision Zero into LATR was the primary goal of this year's update to the SSB with regard to the transportation element. In some ways, we did this very directly. We had the board's recommendation for a Vision Zero impact statement, and we talked about the incorporation of a safety system test. This way was a little bit less direct. Here, the board was simply saying that we would rather that we would rather collect a payment from an applicant than have the applicant implement a roadway capacity improvement that would be a detriment to the safety of non-motorized roadway users. So
where is the safety part, Jason? Where is that stipulated? Because, I would strongly agree with the framework that safety comes first.
Right.
Where I'm still trying to understand this here is there's an assertion made that basically anything that isn't explicitly and exclusively pedestrian and bike infrastructure is bad for safety.
Right. Well, what we were saying.
I don't believe that. I don't think everyone believes
no,
that.
but the whole premise of Vision Zero.
I'm trying to understand where, no, Vision Zero does not say you can never do anything for automobiles. It says that safety comes first. That's what it says.
Right.
Where is safety the priority versus, all these other issues?
Right. I think the more important point that the board was trying to get at was even beyond the actual prioritization. Like, to a certain extent, personally, I'd say we can get rid of the prioritization if we just had a simple statement that said, that any roadway capacity improvement cannot come at the cost of or run counter to the other, the safety for the other roadway users. And leave it at that. And so then the board and DOT can make that determination and say, in cases where we find that the proposed solution would actually do harm to a pedestrian safety or bicycle safety, then in those cases, we're going to accept payment instead. And so then as DOT
and I would add one more thing to that. I think you're right that you could make that explicit and say, safety for pedestrians does not mean you can never widen a road or change the signal timing to benefit cars. Obviously, I think I hope we're in agreement that we shouldn't do that if it reduces safety by any appreciable level for pedestrians. The other thing I would add to that is to say, I disagree with DOT to the extent they said, well, let's be mode neutral. Let's not be mode neutral. Let's prefer bikes, pedestrians, and transit to cars. So if you're going to tweak this, I would suggest you say, can't come at the expense of safety and must prioritize level of service, not just safety, but level of service for bikes, pedestrians, and transit. Not that you can never make the improvement for the car, but that should only happen if you can do that without goring the ox of these alternative modes.
Talk to me, Jason, about what some of the bike and the PHED, those tests, as you had proposed it, it can't come at the expense of, what I heard was it can't come at the expense of the results of those tests. I don't really know what that means. Can you explain us, what that really means?
Sure. Well, kind of this gets to what Chair Anderson was saying, where if the capacity solution is to widen the road, and it will potentially make that intersection then fail the pedestrian test because you now have a wider road. And now it's more difficult for a pedestrian to safely cross that road. So that's basically that, where we're saying that you can't do something that will run counter to.
But it's still a judgment, right? I mean, there's still a rational judgment process here. I mean, I could see an instance where an improved intersection might be wider, but it is safer. You're not saying that that's impossible, are you?
Right. No, there's an objective test. There are industry standards for how long a pedestrian in number of feet per second, right? The signal should be long enough so a pedestrian can cross in a light cycle without the signal changing on them. And the assumptions about how physically fit that pedestrian is or how old they are, they're basically baked in. So it's like the assumption is a normal able-bodied adult should be able to walk X feet per second. And the signals are timed around that assumption. Unfortunately, we do have intersections still where it's challenging even for somebody who's very physically fit to scamper across the street before the light changes. That's what we're trying to avoid. And particularly where you have elderly people, people with disabilities, little kids, there needs to be some cushion to have a high level of service and safety for pedestrians at that light. That's what we're getting at. And you can
We're losing you, Casey. We're losing you.
Not in a car.
Yeah.
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 A little ironic.
All right.
Can I just say, that, whenever a lane is added, there is built into every signal cycle in this county, the assumption that you need to have enough time for pedestrian crossings for 3.5 feet per second is what the speed of the walker is. It used to be 4. It was reduced to 3.5 because of the understanding that there were a lot of elderly people have harder time crossing. They needed more time to cross. And that's been a long process over the last decade or more, but I believe now all the signals in the county have changed to 3.5 feet per second. So if you add a lane, you're actually also adding to the time of the walk cycle. So, and you'll get into some of the pedestrian PLOC discussion next Thursday, but there are also things you can do like making sure there's a wide enough pedestrian refuge and that it's raised or not. I mean, there are all kinds of ways of making the PED crossing more comfortable. And it's interesting using different language. We're saying comfort for pedestrians. We're talking about tolerable for drivers, but nevertheless, that's
Mr. Chair, is it possible for the committee members to start?
After I'm done, yes. I have the floor.
I'll stop.
So the planning board's recommendation was characterized, I think, a little inaccurately as nothing can be done for vehicles under this framework. And that's not really what I'm hearing from the planning board's description. It's just that really safety can't be compromised. But when you can put everything together, and you might still end up with capacity improvements or operational improvements, it's just that you're not going to go right to that. So I'm a lot more comfortable with the planning board's recommendation, based on better understanding that. All right, Councilmember Juwando texted me. Councilmember Friedson, you're after him.
Councilmember Friedson had his hand up before I texted.
That's all right. You can go first. I'll go ahead.
I lost track, so I was going by what was written down.
That's fine. Yeah. It's been a while since either of us has spoken. So go ahead, Councilmember Juwando.
To that last point that Chair Reamer made, that's really a key point to me, that what's allowable and what the objective test is, and looking at the totality of the circumstances, to use the legal term, which is what we want. And I just want to say, I know Chair Anderson directly commented on me and made some comments. We all want safety. I think any idea that we don't want safety is just like, let's get rid of that. I'm actually am kind of pissed off about that. So let's just throw that out and not do that, because we all want people to be safe. And it's about how do we balance these needs in a county that is one of the most diverse in the country as far as everything we have. And so the point for me is, yes, let's state safety is first. That is number one. I declared racism a public health crisis because Black and brown residents get hit by cars, trucks, and buses more because of the way our streets and roadways are designed. So obviously that's a huge component. I pressed DOT on the 3.5 seconds not actually working, because I've walked streets and where we don't have the current time right. So we need to push that. So yes, let's do that. But let's have a test that objectively takes everything. What I don't want to happen is, and what is concerning me about what Dr. Orland has said, and I still am not sure on this, and gets to what Mr. Reamer just said, are we just saying that a payment's going to say, you just do a payment and you don't have to do anything? You don't have to do any analysis around potential roadway improvements, all the list of priorities that we have. I don't want that to happen. I don't want that to be the default. And if there can be language, if someone can explain to me how that would be guarded against in practical terms, that would not be allowed to happen, I'd be much more comfortable with what the planning board is proposing. But I'm not hearing that. I haven't heard that answered. So maybe if Dr. Orland could express to me that concern and why you have that concern, and then if someone else on maybe DOT or planning can respond about why you think that's not a concern, or it is, or how we can build in language to guard against that.
Sure, if I'm on. Yeah, I'm on.
You're on.
Yeah, I'm on. Thank you. I'm not, in my experience, what will happen is that, not in every case, but in most cases, the developer will say, all right, if I can't do it with TDM, let me just make a payment and I'm over with this thing. I don't have to worry about anything else that'll improve, that'll make the situation intolerable. Because that's what we're talking about. Intolerable.
And who has to accept
drivers.
that? Who determines whether that's an acceptable solution? Planning?
Well, you would be deciding that in terms of these priorities. If you put into the priorities that the second priority is after TDM is a payment in lieu, then you will have done it. And if the developer wants to do that, then the planning board has no choice.
Well, no,
This,
the decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, looking at every individual development review application. It's not that there's no choice. I think that I don't know that we're as far apart as all of this conversation is leading us. I think we all agree TDM is the first choice. I think we all agree that operational improvements should be looked at. That certainly makes a lot of sense. We should be having our existing infrastructure operate at its most efficient capacity to meet all of our different goals. I think that in red areas, we've agreed that since there's not a motor vehicle test, there would be this payment in lieu if those things are still an issue. It's in the orange, yellow, and green areas where we're sort of saying everyone's still going to have to, in the orange, yellow, and green areas, is still going to have to do the motor vehicle test. We will have a test to find out if the development is going to have an impact on roadways in the orange, yellow, and green areas. And if they've done that and they've said TDM doesn't work, operational improvements don't work, I think the only thing we're really arguing about at this point is, should we allow a payment in lieu of the kinds of physical improvements that their study, their transportation study, may lean towards, or shall we make them actually build those physical improvements? That's really what we're down to. And then DOT has added another nuance, which is if they pay,
What does that money go to? How's it
what
used?
does that money go to? And they want flexibility for it to go to a wide variety of possible transportation solutions.
Right.
And so I think that really it's simply a question of, do you want to require the applicant to physically make the improvements? Or, I think we should have, frankly, language that offers flexibility, that says they could be required to physically make improvements, but they could also be required, again, this is in the orange, yellow, and green areas, to pay a fee in lieu and work with DOT to figure out the best use of that money to actually provide the most safety, which is the bottom line.
Right,
That
but to
sounds-
make sure that that's prioritized.
That sounds reasonable to me, the way you stated it, Director Wright. And I just want to make sure that there is discussion in DOT and everyone's in. We're actually going through that process, looking at what those tests are being done, the costs are being measured, and that there's a weighing of that. And so in Mr. Orland's proposal, you didn't include the payment; you just removed it from the red and orange, from the orange and yellow areas. That's correct, right?
correct.
Okay.
If we do have a mitigation payment in the other areas, we would need to have a formula for that. We just can't say a mitigation payment. There would need to be some kind of something like we had in the bike test, for example, where the mitigation payment is reasonably close to what the developer would have had to pay otherwise for the bikeway that he's not being required to build. Same is true with the transit part. We need to have some kind of language which either says specifically or comes very close to saying what this mitigation payment is. You just can't just say, and there will be a mitigation payment. So
Right.
we'd have to work on that.
I'd be comfortable with something like that if we could work that out. And it was the lower priority. It was the other things were looked at first. That's which I think is what you said. So, all right.
I think we're converging here. Let's clarify though, Gwen, what you just described, what is missing? What needs to be written from what you just described?
Well, it's in a way, it's a melding of what was in the planning board's draft and some of the things that were in Glenn's draft with the added idea of DOT of saying, let us, if there is a mitigation payment, have some flexibility in deciding what to use it. And maybe what we could do, again, is with Glenn, come back and see if this melded approach could be written up, and we could talk about the formula for mitigation and come back to you with some language.
And you can make clear that priority is safety and that level of service for all modes counts, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Almost. Can I suggest, I think we have a hard stop in 5 minutes, what I understand, because of the 12:10 today. Isn't there some kind of county executive event that will cut into the broadcast?
Flashes,
Is that today?
that may have already happened, but yeah.
I think at some point I was in the queue here.
Yeah, you're still up.
On the committee.
Okay, just didn't know.
Okay, Andrew.
Okay, well, I guess I think we're heading in a fine direction. I mean, I was fine with the planning board's recommendation. I still think that we're kind of heading back to where we started with what the planning board had suggested. I do have a fundamental disagreement with Dr. Erlin here that, it seemed to be the suggestion is that if you have a payment in lieu at any point, that there will be nothing other than that anything that is after that. And I don't think that that's necessarily accurate. I understand the point, but I just don't agree. I also have some concerns about the idea of providing too much flexibility.
Mayor Anderson needs to go on mute. There we go. All right.
I also have some concerns about too much flexibility, frankly. I mean, we just had a long conversation with the school system about wanting to target the funding to the place where the impact is. And, there's a difference between a fee and a tax, and a fee is supposed to mitigate the impact or the cost or the burden, one way or another to the community. And so, I do think we need to be sensitive to that. And, I'd be happy to look at what the language is that staff comes back with, but I'm not sure that I'm totally on board with going along with that. Although obviously I understand that DOT would always want to have as much flexibility as possible to fund the things, that are needed. And I'm sensitive to that, but I think that, we have to understand what the purpose of this is. And, a payment in lieu is supposed to be to pay for something that is going to happen that relates to the project. You're not building the bike lane, but you're providing funding so that the bike lane can be built, once it's pulled together. I also wanted to dispute a few things that were said earlier that, concerned me. I mean, the idea earlier that delay has nothing to do with speed defies logic. I mean, delay literally is about speed. It's how quickly you make it through an intersection. It's literally called throughput. It is what the standard that we set to determine adequacy of intersections. And one of the things that we're trying to get away from is exclusively looking at throughput to determine a functioning or a failing intersection, because it has historically discounted the life-threatening circumstances for pedestrians to cross that intersection. And similar to what Councilmember Jawando said earlier about the 3.5 seconds and walking these intersections and seeing how it can be a challenge, the reason why we don't have longer times is to keep throughput. I mean, it all comes down to the MUTCD, the Manual Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the engineering standards with which we're making these decisions. So, I'm happy to have a broader conversation about how all of these things fit together. But if we want to be consistent with everything else that we've said, the idea that capacity, which is largely adding lanes and expanding roads, is the last resort, that would be consistent. It's not saying it is a never resort. It should never happen, because there are certainly instances where it should happen, but it should be the last thing that we look at. We should look at how to re-engineer the road within its existing footprint for all users in order to be able to, address the issues that we have. So I think happy with the planning board recommendation. I'm okay with trying to find some melding, as Ms. Wright mentioned in her typical diplomatic terms, to bring us all here together and to build consensus. But I do have some concerns, and I do think we still need to address the idea of putting a payment in with ultimate flexibility to DOT, because I think that does defeat, in many respects, the entire purpose of the payments, which is to address the impact and the issues that are being created based on the test that we're setting.
So we'd want to have a nexus similar to as we established for schools. All right. So Gwen, I think a lot of us are looking to you here to put this together, working with Glenn and Gary.
Well, and certainly Jason and Eric Gray and that team. We'll get together and try to see if we can find some melding language.
Okay.
And if, can I just add, if we can get this, we have, we'll just to wrap this up in a bow, we have a committee meeting next Thursday. And if we can try to work this out over the next couple of days, we have a packet that's due Monday or Tuesday.
Yeah.
And we can include it in there so you can look at it again before it goes to council.
Great. All right. We've got 8 minutes before the hard stop at 12:20.
12:20.
The last issue is the name of the policy. So I'd like to hear from Planning Board about their vision here. We still have you, Casey? There you are. Okay.
Honestly, I didn't love this name, but so maybe Glenn could speak to it.
Okay, cool.
Well, I can, or Jason can. I think, I'll just say my own little 2 cents, and then I'm going to turn it to Jason. Subdivision staging policy was a name that had its moment when we were doing many subdivisions, where we were taking greenfields lots and breaking them up into individually subdivided lots. Really and truly, we still have some of those, but we don't have a lot of those anymore. The majority of the cases that come before the planning board are actually lot consolidation to create a new subdivided and consolidated lot to build an infill kind of project. So it seemed to us that it was, again, a sort of symbolic change, that what we're really talking about here is our growth policy for the county, not how we're staging subdivisions, because really we aren't doing that many traditional subdivisions. But
I strongly agree. I think the second you say the word subdivision, you've lost 95% of the people in this county who have no idea what a subdivision is. I think saying growth policy, it means something meaningful to just about everybody. And I know that some would like it to be more precise, but I really think that this language excludes people and closes the door to an average person's understanding of a critical issue. It is about growth. It's about what happens when growth happens. It's about whether we'll get growth or not. It's about all these things. But I think your average person has a perspective on growth. They might say we have too much. They might say we have too little. They might say it's about right. But I think your average person has no idea what we're talking about when we say either adequate public facilities or subdivision staging. They're both jargon. And I just think we've got to at least have a chance that somebody who is not a professional might want to participate in this conversation. And I think framing it as growth, opens the door to that. All right, my colleagues, Will, you're first.
Yeah, Dr. Orland, I'd want to hear your comment. I read the packet, but it was kind of Groundhog Day. This is why they changed it in the first place, because people didn't know what it meant, and so I don't think this is, I agree with you that SSP is not right. But I don't think that this is technically right either. This, most of the discussion here is like its impact. It's what are the roads and schools? What can they bear and what can they do? And I think, I know you're saying it's jargon, but I think if you say to the average person, this is about, the roads and school capacity that we should have for the development we get or want to have, whatever that is. And people can disagree on how to get there, but I think some nexus to the adequacy of infrastructure is important to explain what this is. And so I don't think growth policy captures that completely. I think it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I wanted to allow Dr. Orland, that's my off the cuff.
Sure.
I'm not wedded to SSP, but this doesn't seem quite right to me either.
Sure. Should I weigh in now, or?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, again, our problem, the reason why it was changed years ago is because the public totally didn't understand what growth policy was. They thought, see, growth policy, I don't like what's in the master plan. Oh, growth policy, I don't like what's in the zoning. Oh, growth policy, I can't get a building permit. Why can't I get a building permit? There were all kinds of people who thought the growth policy was something other than what it was. So in sort of truth in advertising, we said subdivision staging policy because that's really what it was. At that time, and actually still is, even the consolidation of lot goes through a subdivision review and approval process. But we understand, I mean, really what this is, and this is why we're suggesting as an alternative, if you want to change the name, adequate public facilities policy. This is the policy that literally implements the adequate public facility ordinance. And it guarantees or tries to achieve and make sure that there are adequate public facilities. So that's why, if you're going to change the name, we would recommend that. And just point out also that whatever we do, if we're going to change the name, we need a bill to do it. That's not a big deal, but it just means introducing a separate bill. Because the words are throughout the code, so we need to replace
Thank you.
it.
I don't think this is the most important issue, but I do agree that
That's why we saved it for last.
the current one does not make sense. I don't know if growth is much better, but
I agree that maybe growth isn't the most precise, but I think it is the one that is the most, it has the most meaning to the most number of people, and it's generally adequate enough that people, and I hear what you're saying, Glenn, but I just think fundamentally this does have a big effect on the growth of the county. And it's about what happens with growth, you know, as a result of growth, as a condition of growth. It is about growth. So I just think I really, anyway, I've said what I've said already. I'm repeating myself. Andrew, do you want to speak now or do you want to hear Jason? He had a comment.
Jason, go first.
Okay, thank you. It'll take 2 seconds. One, I would just say that, you know, adequate public facilities ordinance and policy, people don't understand that either. They think public facilities and they think of restrooms. So I would say, you know, one other thing.
I was going to say that, so thanks for making sure I didn't have to.
Okay.
I made that. That's a good connection. Yeah.
Right. But I think that, you know, one of the other things that we had proposed to the board and the board considered was calling it the growth and infrastructure policy, where people understand infrastructure, they understand growth, and it's the connection between the two. So that's just another thing for you to consider.
I like that.
Yeah, I'd be good with growth and infrastructure policy. I think that works. That's fundamentally what this is, about growth and infrastructure. I think this is easily and dramatically the least consequential, least important decision that we make. So I'm really hoping that we don't spend a whole lot of time on it, because the substance of
we've only got 1 minute left, so
is what matters. I was going to say that I don't think that people know what public facilities are and what we're determining what they are, and I do think the reason why the council moved away from the growth policy, at least my understanding of it, is that growth was a dirty word in Montgomery County. In Montgomery County politics, nobody wanted to talk about growth. Nobody wanted to be about growth, and it had kind of a very radioactive, significant political ramification to it. That
we're out of time, my friends. It's 12:20.
You were for growth or you were against growth. So
I think growth and
infrastructure.
Yeah, let's settle on that. I think we're in agreement.
Okay.
We go.
All right, we got to go. We're otherwise it won't be an open meeting anymore. So thank you. We're adjourned. Thank you for everybody. We'll get details soon. All right.
Who were visibly excited when they discovered what was at their door.
This was unexpected. Thank you so much.